Are we live? Okay. Just let us know when to start. We can begin. I think so. Ladies and gentlemen. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another part of PhilosophyCon. Today we have a pleasure of listening to prelection made by Francisco Collado Rodriguez, and the prelection is titled Consumerism, Post-Humanity, and the Echoes of Narcissus in Shirley and Gibson's The Belonging Kind. Please, sir, you can start now.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation to attend and to participate in your interesting conference, mostly about the way beyond carbon, the way beyond our materiality. Well, as you have said, my paper today is Consumerism, Post-Humanity, and the Echoes of Narcissus in the Belonging Kind. Okay, in his sixth column for the magazine Interzone, author Bruce Sterling recounts how the cyberpunk movement and its poetics had sprouted in the early 1980s, arguably to die only a few years later in the 1990s. Sterling pointed out the capacity of cyberpunk to anticipate a bleak forthcoming for humanity and to erase any previous confidence in the future that classic science fiction might have offered sometimes earlier to their readers. By the end of the 20th century, once postmodernism had questioned the old humanist values, the use of technology was not going to be necessarily positive or lead to the massive creation of immortal perfect beings, as later promised by the transhumanist project. On the contrary, Sterling's analysis of the condition of humanity at the turn of the millennium was rather pessimistic. It had become clear, he wrote, and as you can see in quotation number 1, okay, it had become clear that there are no sacred boundaries to protect humans from themselves. Sterling interrogated the possibilities for the future of humankind, and he dramatically declared what you can see in quotation number 2. Our place in the universe is basically accidental. We are weak and mortal, but it's not the holy will of the gods. It's just the way things happen to be at the moment. And this is radically unsatisfactory, not because we direly miss the shelter of the deity, but because, looked at objectively, the veil of human suffering is basically a dump. The human condition can be changed, and it will be changed, and it is changing. The only real questions are how and to what end. By the end of the second millennium, critic Catherine Hales debated on how our veil of human suffering was turning our old human species into the new post-human one. Strongly relying on Norbert Weiner's theories, in her book, How We Became Posthuman, Hales defined the new posthuman creature as being the result of a strong techno-scientific and cultural change, and linked the new paradigmatic condition to our increasing understanding that we are basically the result of information and information patterns. Not surprisingly, the consideration of ourselves as information led other critics to develop the notion of transhumanism. With it, as you know, they signified the new state that results of biotechnological body enhancements and the predictable advent of processes in which even a full consciousness might expand their life by inhabiting a technological device or a virtual space. However, this optimistic transhumanist approach seems to have at least two flaws. On the one hand, there is only a very limited group of mostly wealthy people who can have access to sophisticated body enhancement, leaving the rest exposed to living conditions that, as things seem to go, might increasingly lower the species down to the level of a infra-humanity, not a transhumanity. On the other hand, in the formulation of the posthuman, the basic premise that humans are information make of us an easy target for mass media manipulation. In the 1950s, Norbert Weiner's insights on the issue of mass manipulation proved to be prophetic. For Weiner, the erosion of human and machine became one of the big issues to account for the future of humanity. Concerned about developing intelligent machines that could replicate human brain patterns, when looking at his aim from the opposite perspective, this father of cybernetics also anticipated unnerving results. This is your quotation number 3. This is Weiner. I have spoken of machines, but not only of machines having brains of brass and thews of iron. When human atoms are knit into an organization in which they are used, not in their full right as responsible human beings, but as cogs and levers and rods, it matters little that the raw material is flesh and blood. What is used as an element in a machine is, in fact, an element in the machine. This work offers an analysis of a short story by cyberpunk writer Shirley and Gibson that they wrote at the beginning of the 1980s, as a reflection of the limits that a transhuman approach may find from our present condition. It's interesting to say that this story shows a deep concern with a lack of critical capacity seemingly existing among people living in the United States and by extension in Western societies. In line with Weiner's early analysis of the relations between humans and machines, Marshall McLuhan's theory of self-amputation and Baumann's concept of modern liquidity also help to our reading of the story as being far away from any optimistic notion of transhumanism. At the beginning of the introduction to his collection of essays, Understanding Media, The Extensions of Man, Marshall McLuhan wrote this illuminating and prophetic passage that you can read in quotation number 4. After 3,000 years of explosion by means of fragmentary and mechanical technologies, the Western world is imploding. During the mechanical ages, we had extended our bodies in space. Today, after more than a century of electric technology, we have extended our central nervous system itself in a global embrace, abolishing both space and time as far as our planet is concerned. Rapidly, we approach the final phase of the extensions of man, the technological simulation of consciousness, when the creative process of knowing will be collectively and corporately extended to the whole of human society, much as we have already extended our senses and our nerves by the various media. McLuhan published his famous book in 1964, but he could already foresee that a technological simulation of human consciousness was being achieved thanks to the new technologies, and that eventually it would affect everybody in the planet, which led to his well-known notion of our world becoming a global village in which human individuals are its electrodes. In addition, McLuhan associated a process of self-amputation to the acquisitions of new technological skills or extensions of man that precede the alleged process of total collective knowing. With his characteristic cryptic style, McLuhan pointed out that with every new extension of man, a price has to be paid, a price that he called self-amputation. In one of the most widely cited essays collected in his book, the essay called, The Gadget Lover, Narcissus as Narcosis, McLuhan warned his readers that acquiring a new extension brings about a process of narcosis or dumbness. Narcissus became numb when watching his image or reflective extension in the water, and as a result, he drowned. However, in his interpretation of the classic myth, the Canadian professor pragmatically concludes that Narcissus did not drown because he was in love with himself, as we have been repeatedly told, but because he was not aware that the reflection in the water was his own image, his own extension. Thus, lack of self-awareness becomes an open gate to human numbness. Further in his contention, McLuhan argues that self-amputation forbids self-recognition, which results in the fact that our culture is, or already was in the 1960s, narcotized. What follows in his essay on narcosis is a development of a well-known notion that has been amply proven by the abundant literature existing nowadays on the effects produced by the excessive use of the smartphone or the video games or of constantly surfing the internet. As he asserts, and this is finally your quotation number 5, the principle of self-amputation as an immediate relief of strain on the central nervous system applies very readily to the origin of the media of communication from speech to computer. In other words, the extension takes over. As a result, our consciousness is progressively suppressed, and thus we become slaves of the system. In the field of creative literature, such process becomes symbolized in the bodiless new hackers that William Gibson wrote about when, by surfing the web, the matrix, as he called it, his cyberpunk characters left the meat behind in his first novel, in Neuromancer. In cyberpunk, but also in terror fiction and film, it is frequent now to find warning and scary images of new kinds of individuals that are described as empty shells or even as contemporary living dead or zombies moving from material into virtual space and back. These creatures have proliferated in written and audiovisual narratives of the last decades, in my interpretation, as symbolic icons of the collective process of ultimate self-amputation. Such abundant dystopic symbolism on the results brought about by the transformation of the human into new intended transhuman creatures insistently points towards unwanted consequences existing in the present paradigmatic shift. Shirley and Gibson's short story, The Belonging Kind, which, by the way, you can find it's in open access in the web, already offered in the early 1980s a symbolic reading of humanity as being in the process of becoming self-amputated, that is to say, numbed by its new condition. The reasons for such process to take place clearly point to the capitalist system and its resulting consumers' economy. Life in Shirley and Gibson's story has become a cycle of production and consumption that keeps people enslaved. Thus, in practice, they become servants of apparently unknown forces whose nature, although in a conceited way, the cyberpunk authors gradually reveal along the pages of their short story. Their tale explicitly describes the means to acquire the ultimate extensions of man. They go from fashion to shape shifting to money making, which leads to a reading of the belonging kind as a subtle exemplification, or better, anticipation of that condition of our times that Zygmunt Bauman famously denominated liquid modernity. Although from a different perspective, Bauman complements McLuhan's theories when he contends that by the end of the 20th century, traditional solid ideologies have been erased to be replaced only by shallow and permanently flowing consumption, a move that systematically decreases the critical capacity of the human being, coinciding somehow with McLuhan's idea of the self-amputated individual. First published in 1981, The Belonging Kind is a strange tale that narratologically transgresses the classic boundaries existing between narratives of manners, narratives of horror, and science fiction. Its unknown omniscient narrator follows a protagonist, somebody called Coretti, who in his turn chases obsessively a mysterious girl from bar to bar in a big city. By means of quick narrative brushes, Coretti is soon described as somebody who does not fit well anywhere he goes. He's a teacher of linguistics in a community college, but paradoxically, he is unable to communicate with other people, even if he goes to many bars trying to establish new friendships. The narrator portrays him as somebody who lives in isolation. However, Coretti's life experiences a dramatic change when, attracted by this girl, he begins to stalk her. The element of fantasy appears when eventually the protagonist realizes that the girl has the outstanding capacity to change her dress, her hair, and even her shape in keeping with a type of bar or club that she visits. That is to say, she's a contemporary shape shifter, a new version of one of the oldest creatures that have traditionally inhabited mythologies all around the world. When, after much effort, Coretti is able to start a conversation with a girl, she replies by imitating his own tone and insecure voice. However, the narrator informs readers that she is not a mimic, but one of the belonging kind. She fits perfectly in any environment because of her capacity to transform her emotionless self accordingly. That is, in addition to her capacity to change her shape and clothes, she is, as McLuhan's Narcissus, she is unconscious of her own self, moving along an urban environment described by the narrator in terms of quickly shifting bars, dresses, and drinks. In addition, the narrative voice offers different descriptions of the settings that characters visit that frequently refer to their art deco decoration and to mass-produced furniture, which may allow readers to conclude the important role played by popular art and culture, by consumerism, and by the mass media in the formation of this mysterious belonging kind. Moreover, the narrator provides descriptions that are frequently mediated by mirrored images. These reflections come from actual mirrors, but also from bottles and glassware of the bars that they visit, and offer readers the possibility to know the moral, but also the physical description of the protagonist. Mirrors become symbolic warnings that direct access to reality is not possible any longer. Nothing appears beyond the array of clothes, drinks, and bars that, condensed in the figure of the girl, continuously lure the protagonist into abandoning his previous life as a linguist who can still recognize himself condemned in the figure of the girl, while Coretti follows and shifts the protagonist and her male friend from bar to bar. The protagonist gradually builds an incredible tolerance to alcoholic drinks, similar to the strange creatures that he is following. If in the first pages of the story, Coretti is still conscious of his own being, unable to study himself in the mirror, his state of self-consciousness progressively disappears. At an early moment of his metamorphosis, and despite his heavy drinking, he is still able to understand the shallow nature of the creatures he is chasing, as you can read in quotation number 6. They were the kind you see in bars who seem to have grown there, who seem genuinely at home there, not drunks, but human fixtures, functions of the bar, the belonging kind. The shifting, fluid creatures in their sea of fashion and alcohol may recall features of disguised invaders from sci-fi horror movies from the 1950s, especially in the episode when the protagonist follows them to their hotel room. There, Coretti discovers that they perch like birds and even show, quotation number 7, membranes, third eyelids that reflected the faint shades of neon from the window. However, the protagonist's shock when he sees the perching creatures progressively disappears because he starts changing into one of those liquid creatures and becomes trapped in their cycle of consumerism. It is sufficient for the belonging kind to consume their alcoholic liquids, and they can shift clothes and appearances and provide insubstantial conversations as if they were functions of the bar. They can even make money out of their own bodies, which they use to buy more drinks that allow their existential consumerist cycle to start again. Increasingly, Shirley and Gibson's tale shows a profound pessimism in the future of humanity represented by Coretti. Despite his disturbing findings about these creatures, the protagonist becomes further attracted to them. As a result, he loses his job at the community college. He symbolically renounces any Christian belief he had. And finally, after much drinking, he even becomes able to fabricate his own money. His first act of fluid copulation with a girl he had been stalking happens also in a bar, after which he is able to maintain a mindless conversation with a bartender, which prompts the narrator to add the final ironic sentence in the story. And Coretti said it right, like a real human being. According to Bauman, constructing a durable identity in liquid modernity becomes increasingly difficult, when not impossible. The task, he writes, is consumption, and consumption is an utterly, irredeemably individual pastime, a string of sensations which can be experienced, lived through only subjectively. Shelley and Gibson's liquid consumers of fashion, alcohol, and empty conversations live mechanic lives that are centered on the notion of satisfaction in distraction. In addition, the sharp cyberpunk authors frequently connect such type of life to Art Deco and mass culture as indicators of the progressive lack of solid ideologies that characterizes postmodern or liquid modernity. In The Belonging Kind, the stoker is finally absorbed into the belonging kind itself when, as McLuhan's Narcissus, he becomes unable, finally, to recognize himself in the mirror. Corelli's human image disappears when his former solid isolation progressively gives way to his utter dissolution into the social closed circle of consumption that characterizes the new belonging kind. The result is a paradoxical new type of being, a non-conscious member of a monstrous gathering, unable to recognize himself as distinct from the others. The same as tourists do, the belonging kind accept everything they see wherever they go and leave their money to the place without altering the system in any way. Corelli is accepted into the communitarian tribe of the unself-conscious belonging kind at a time in which communitarianism, as Bauman contends, has been increasingly accepted as a mechanical and sedative alternative to the existential horrors still found in the fluid condition of contemporary society. In conclusion, Corelli represents the post-human slaves of a new social order. The short story describes the formation of a new species, a fresh but unreflective slave community that, as Bauman also warns, is born as a mere wish to cope with the existential lack. As this philosopher writes, in my final quotation, the main appeal of communitarianism is a promise of a safe haven, the dream destination for sailors lost in a turbulent sea of constant, unpredictable, and confusing change. The desire for plenitude, represented in the completion of the circle of consumerism, lures people to go forward to a future that hides nothing but their own self-destruction as people. As represented in this short story, around the birth of the third millennium, the consumerist and technological extensions of man have taken over the informational fluids that run our bodies. Such extensions are ultimately entropic, as they disguise or respond to an aspiration to get rid of bodily individualities in favor of a wish to live eternal lives, numbed in the collectivity of selfless beings. The belonging kind unveils and describes Sterling's human condition that will be changed in the near future. Along the process, a higher ratio in fluid information seems to have accelerated our mental entropic condition. As happened to Narcissus, such condition means numbness, and it makes us an easy prey to be controlled by the system, whatever or whomever the system may be. Ideologically, the new existential stage represented by the absorbing belonging kind stands very far away from the Jungian mandala, the cycle of primordial youth. The latter required reflection and promises of self-discovery. The FOMA represents the ultimate victory as a circle of the consumerist extensions over their human containers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now, do we have another prelegent, Mateusz Sawczyn? Okay, we are wondering, do we now have another prelegent, or are we having a discussion? Okay. So in that instance, we will now watch the video and have the conjunct a discussion in the end of the panel.
Okay, do I stay here or?
Yes. Okay.
Hi everyone, and thank you for joining me virtually. I'm sad that I can't be there today with you all at what I'm sure is a really intellectually provocative and enjoyable convention. My name is Ariel Croon, and I'm a Canadian settler scholar of Dutch ancestry. I currently live and work on the traditional territories of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, otherwise known as Kitchener, Ontario. I just defended my PhD at the University of Alberta in September, where I spent 6 years studying Canadian post-apocalyptic science fiction, published between the years of 1948 and 1989. I was really excited when the organizers reached out to me to give a talk around the theme of cyberpunk in science fiction at a philosophy convention/conference, because the last chapter of my dissertation has a section on cyberpunk. But I wasn't really able to fully delve into the really interesting philosophy, especially the aesthetics of the future, that were and are still propelled by it, and how it has evolved and changed, or not so much as the case may be, over the past 3 decades to where we are now, and how the genre of solarpunk has emerged in the 21st century to present another vision of the future. This paper is my attempt at sketching an outline of those thoughts. I'm going to begin by describing a setting from SF that may seem familiar to many of you. This place is an island nation, and travel across the island is only permitted if you have a passport. For the first time that you're caught traveling without papers, you get let go with a warning, but if you go outside your designated zone again without permission, you are immediately punished by being forced into slavery. Oh yeah, this island society has slaves. 2 per household, actually. And there are no private places for anyone, slaves or free citizens, to gather. Atheism is seen as a danger to the state, and so while atheists are tolerated, priests of any religion will regularly go to engage atheist individuals in conversation in an attempt to convert them. This place has a couple of bonus gross rules also, wherein premarital sex is punished by a lifetime of enforced celibacy, and wives have to quote-unquote confess their sins to their husbands once a month. Some of you may have already guessed it, but the place I'm describing is not actually a future dystopian cyberpunk society that rebels have to live in and fight against, but actually is the original utopia, capital U, by Sir Thomas More. published in the book of the same name in 1516. I'm not going to get into the history of Utopia's publication, its social context, or scholarly opinions of it as parodical or socialist propaganda, because that's not what has survived within the cultural imagination, and the ideas called to mind by the word utopia. What's carried on down through history hasn't been any of that, but merely the idea and aesthetics of utopia, of a magical place where everyone is happy and society works really well. Well, let me qualify that. It works really well for some people, and those are the people who are happy. Those also happen to be the people who are in the same social class and identify the same way as Sir Thomas. From one angle, it does work really well. Free adult male citizens and happy heterosexual marriages are enjoying this society to the fullest. The point overall that I want to preface my talk with is that one person's utopia of the future can be another's future dystopia. This isn't really a new concept in science fiction or philosophy, and I really doubt that it is to you also, but I wanted to state it for posterity, and for you to keep that in mind while thinking about cyberpunk and how it views the future, and how we can interpret cyberpunk as a vision of a dystopia or utopia to come. Cyberpunk was famously introduced in William Gibson's novel Neuromancer in 1984, but I want to focus on his short story, The Gernsback Continuum, which was first published in 1981 and then later collected in Burning Chrome in 1986. I argue that it sets out the philosophical rationale for and aims of a brand new genre, cyberpunk, as explicitly talking back to earlier science fiction. The name Gernsback refers to the American author and publisher Hugo Gernsback, who is also the man the Hugo Awards are named after. He was a big deal because he published the very first science fiction magazine, Amazing Stories, which began its run in 1926, and he coined the term science fiction in 1929. Back then, SF was still kind of coalescing, and the aesthetics of science fiction, or SF in the 30s, was very Art Deco, and Gernsback both wrote and published other writers whose stories focused on new technology and gadgetry, so that the magazine became synonymous with the genre that we would now identify as retrofuturism, and which Gibson's story calls ray gun Gothic, which actually ended up coining the term. It is an architectural and visual style that's situated in the context of the golden age of modern design due to its use of features such as, quote, single support beams, acute angles, brightly colored paneling, unquote, as well as, quote, shapes and cutouts showing motion, unquote. It is these images that the narrator of Gibson's story begins to see manifesting around him. This nameless protagonist is a photographer on assignment to take pictures of old Americana from the 1930s that mimic the style, dreaming of a future that never came about, and he slowly begins to slide into a reality where the future has turned out exactly as the 1930s had thought. This slippage deeply unsettles the narrator, especially when he encounters a young couple from this other reality who are picnicking on the side of the highway. He describes them as heirs to the dream of the alternate 1980s American future. They were white, blonde, and probably had blue eyes. They were American. Here, we'd gone on in a dream logic that knew nothing of pollution, the finite bounds of fossil fuel, or foreign wars that it was possible to lose, unquote. It had all the sinister fruitiness, he says, quote, of Hitler Youth propaganda, unquote. After this vision, he panics and begins to self-medicate with his own reality, on the advice of a friend who tracks down weird news stories for a living, watching hours of terrible TV to try and stay in his own timeline. It begins to work, but slowly. At the end of the story, after he spots a futuristic plane that is a 12-engined thing like a bloated boomerang, all wing, he describes how he rushed to the nearest newsstand and gathered up as much as I could find on the petroleum crisis and the nuclear energy hazard, anxious to find a park bench where I could submerge myself in hard evidence of the human near dystopia we live in, unquote. The cashier at the newsstand notices all the bad news and comments to the narrator that it is a hell of a world, but it could be worse. And the narrator agrees fervently, adding, even worse, it could be perfect. The story never actually names this alternate future a Gernsback Continuum, but the implication is there. The story, to me, perfectly encapsulates the philosophical aims of a cyberpunk as a genre in a single short story, to resist a techno-utopian future that is dictated by the dreams of a past elite. In the other stories in Burning Chrome, as well as in Neuromancer, Gibson focuses on describing the way that technology has broken down or betrayed its original purpose by not working, its components molding or rusting in various states of disrepair, so much so that the degradation of futuristic tech, the environment, and people living in the middle of it became a hallmark aesthetic of cyberpunk. The main narrative through line is of an underclass individual repurposing the technology of the elite to use it to further his own ends, often violently. But that overall, system change is impossible. The genre borrows heavily from noir films of the 30s in characterization and look, and beneath it all is the message that the future is not going to be fundamentally different from the present, but instead more of the same. Technology may change, but people and socioeconomic systems will not. The future of cyberpunk is an ideological extension of the present where the Western philosophy of capital has not changed. Despite all the dystopian trappings, however, the cyberpunk future of Neuromancer was actually thought to be, by the author himself, wildly, almost ridiculously hopeful. Gibson, in an interview with Charlie Jane Anders, admits that he thought, when writing the novel, that he was doing a, quote, ludicrously optimistic science fictional thing, because at that time, anyone with half a brain woke up every day with the consciousness that it could be humanity's last day, unquote. Neuromancer's depiction of a relatively untouched Western society beyond the outbreak and swift wrap-up of World War III and the Cold War flies in the face of the expectations of any SF aspiring to technological realism at the time, and can be read in that valence as incredibly hopeful, almost utopian in its impetus, even though that seems like an extremely low bar to us now in 2021. As a consequence, some critics read the classic cyberpunk setting as extremely dystopic. The text and its author earnestly believes itself to be optimistic in structure and utopic in character action. Readers, fans, and critics alike picked up on this vibe of wild hopefulness, especially with regard to the technological developments in cyberpunk worlds. These are encountered as exceedingly cool, and the genre became extremely popular as a result. Cyberpunk became a cultural phenomenon, but one that was based on a surface-level reiteration of the tropes and aesthetics that were present in a handful of texts. I have some quotes up on the slide from other writers and critics about late 80s cyberpunk, basically hailing it as a revolutionary new movement in science fiction. Cyberpunk also anticipated and gave terms to emerging computer technologies of the late 80s and early 90s, and theorists in academia began to recognize the possibilities, limitations, and ramifications of such technologies that proliferated in cyberpunk stories, such as virtual reality, cyber identity, and artificial intelligence. I have on my shelf a few anthologies of essays that collect various discourses around the possibilities and pitfalls of new technologies for society. Academic Kevin Robbins calls out the discourse around cyberspace as, quote, a utopia for modern times, unquote, that indulges in, quote, spectacular flights of fantasy, unquote. And he quotes other scholars such as Nicole Stenger talking up cyberspace as opening up a, quote, space for collective restoration and for peace, unquote. And Barry Sherman and Phil Judkins characterizing virtual reality as, quote, truly the technology of miracles and dreams, the hope for the next century. It may indeed afford glimpses of heaven, unquote. In an ironic twist, cyberpunk the genre and the cybercultural turn in academia that coincided with it began to aesthetically and philosophically dictate the future in a literary parody of the retrofuturism of the 1930s. Robbins urges his readers to, quote, urgently set about disillusioning ourselves, quote, much like the nameless protagonist of the Gernsback Continuum, reminding ourselves that, quote, the institutions developing and promoting the new technologies exist solidly in this world. We should make sense of them in terms of its social and political realities, and it is in this context that we must assess their significance, unquote. It is easy to get carried away by the aesthetic trappings of technology, of cool rebellion, and the promise of escapism into a different world, and not to realize the underlying social, political, and economic factors that make those dreams of detachment from this world so tempting. In reality, the future of cyberpunk does not differ very much ideologically or philosophically from the Reaganomic American 1980s present in which it was born. Scholar Carolyn Alphen observes a dominant trend in cyberpunk scholarship that draws on Frederick Jameson's diagnosis of, quote, postmodernism as the logic of late capitalism, using Jameson's spatial pastiche, schizophrenic temporality, and waning of affect, unquote. And she argues that the cyberpunk biohacker, quote, reflects an underlying pure neoliberalism at work within accelerationism and its neoliberal governmentalities, unquote. Neuromancer was, and is still, greeted with distaste and horror as a dystopian nightmare by critics. The 80s were not really a great time to identify as anything other than a white heterosexual man in America, and cyberpunk's depiction of a future that reified and cemented social stratification, income disparity, casual and structural misogyny and racism on top of the acceleration of neoliberalism is cause for despair. The advent of cyberpunk was interpreted through a feminist lens as a return to the humanist stream of transcendence, prioritizing the soul or the mind, which was aligned with men, over the body and emotions, which were aligned with women. Writer Melissa Scott observed in the 90s that despite the countercultural and extra-legal actions of console cowboys, the early narratives of cyberpunk are, quote, ultimately a pretty useless thing, a carnival sort of genre in which straight middle-class white men imagine themselves oppressed and end up reaffirming the status quo, unquote. As David R. Cole notes, in cyberpunk it is not, quote, individual or repressed minorities that are finding a new voice in the pack, but it is the peculiar voices of the technologically enhanced that are being heard, unquote. The advanced technology, such as software and quote-unquote wetware, such as body modifications, is accessible only to those with the fiscal means to purchase it, or the connections necessary to obtain it through other means. Scholar Nicola Nixon argues, though, to view the cyberpunk world as Gibson imagined it in Neuromancer as deliberately dystopic would be an active misreading of the novel itself, however. Instead, quote, much as we might flinch at the implications of such triumphs, unquote, Neuromancer has basically a happy ending for its protagonist, a marked departure from the affect of dystopian despair that the genre later took on. Cyberpunk worlds are often pretty fun to explore, its cutthroat philosophy and cool edginess exciting to experiment with, and those are enduring qualities, as shown by the popularity of the genre even now, with the recent buzz about Cyberpunk 2077 and the new Matrix movie coming out. Note how, in 30 years, the base philosophy hasn't really changed, though. The future of 2077 is the same future that was imagined by Cyberpunk in 1987, is the same future that was imagined by writers of post-Cyberpunk in 1997. And that's not a bad thing. But it is worth recognizing that Cyberpunk has become a retro future. The layers of utopia and dystopia that are invoked by Cyberpunk hark back to my earlier point that utopia and dystopia are two sides of the same coin, and it really depends on your position in society as a reader as to what you're going to see. Recognizing your position in society is important generally for life as a human being on this planet, but doubly so when reading any fiction that is labeled as dystopian or utopian. The question in the reader's mind should always be, who is this future utopia for? What makes this futuristic setting dystopian, and why do these characters think that? Enjoying dystopia doesn't make you a bad person, by the way. I want to put that out there. I was and am still very into cyberpunk stories and post-apocalyptic fiction, and I am very drawn to the aesthetic and the idea that I could be a badass individual loner with a lot of power. But I try to be critical in my engagement with that urge to slip into the cyberpunk continuum. Skipping forward in time to the present moment 30-odd years later, the genre of solarpunk has emerged as a push against the cyberpunk retro future in the same way that the Gernsback Continuum pushed against the retro future of earlier SF. I don't think solarpunk should be set up as the opposite of cyberpunk at all, but a new expression of its base impetus, science fiction that identifies the ills of late capitalism. But instead of cynically accepting it as the status quo that is only intensified in the future, solarpunk depicts a better future succeeding over the dystopian present. As Adam Flynn wrote in 2014, quote, we're solarpunks because our only other options are denial or despair, and that, quote, there's something lovely in the way that solarpunk reacts against the mainstream visions of overly smooth, clean, white, modernist iPod futures, unquote. In this last bit of the presentation, I want to make an argument for how the solarpunk movement takes the socio-political critiques of cyberpunk into the 21st century to imagine a future that works towards a utopia for everyone. Making a patchwork polyphonic utopia that attempts to make life better for everyone, no matter their position or place in society, is a pretty huge undertaking. The solarpunk aesthetic reflects that philosophy. With art that is generally Art Nouveau inspired, or depicts scenes of international urban life and feature a lot of healthy greenery, perhaps even evidence of renewable energy such as windmills or solar panels, and it often includes a diversity of humans and animals populating the cityscape or landscape working together. I again see a reflection of cyberpunk in solarpunk's emphasis on aesthetic that embodies philosophy. However, there is a pressing need, as Rob Cameron points out, for solarpunk to detach itself from Western utopic aspirations for the future, if it is to be truly committed to its philosophical ideals of anti-racism and decolonialism. As the Western utopian urge historically and presently generates dystopia in real time for marginalized and oppressed groups worldwide in the form of colonialism, extreme class stratification, wage slavery, environmental damage, and more, in the pursuit of cheap and plentiful goods for the rich to generate happiness and a sense of utopia in the present for them. Resistance to the status quo of hierarchy and oppression is baked into the structure of solarpunk, much like cyberpunk, but its goals are communal and hopeful about the future. Solarpunk fiction varies widely in how far in the future it sets itself. Some stories are very like cyberpunk in their 15 minutes into the future setting, where the world is basically the same and utopia is located in the vision and cooperative actions of the protagonists. Others are set years or centuries into the future, and some are even set in alternate realities with magic realism or fantasy elements. What ties them together is the basic optimism about the future, even given the most dystopian of conditions, and a belief in the ability to change for the better. Some notable solarpunk anthologies include Sunvault, stories of eco-speculation, and Solarpunk, Glass and Gardens, Solarpunk Summers, Wings of Renewal, a Solarpunk Dragons anthology, and Multi-Species Cities, Solarpunk Urban Futures. For more on what solarpunk is, I recommend visiting solarpunks.net, browsing the reference guide for more in-depth history on the development of solarpunk as a genre and philosophy, and checking out St. Andrewism on YouTube. I personally view cyberpunk and solarpunk as different points on the evolution of a philosophy and orientation towards the future and its aesthetic expression. In the 80s, hopefulness consisted in surviving the Cold War. Nowadays, hopefulness consists of surviving like capitalism. Cyberpunk's emphasis on the underdog individual is expanded on by solarpunk, with the recognition that in order to rebel against the socio-political forces of dystopia, it is necessary to work together with others and to recognize their strengths and weaknesses to have a better chance at changing the world. Cyberpunk is the burned-out, cynical Generation X older brother to solarpunk's optimistic younger millennial and Gen Z siblings, who recognize the state of the world and have a different method of reacting to it. The solarpunk philosophy of radical grounded hope focuses on change for the better in the here and now, critical thinking, and methods they learned from their cyberpunk elders to put it to use in a new way. Thank you so much for listening to my talk, and I'm looking forward to interacting with you all in the comments on this video. Please check out the description of this video for info on how to tag me so that I see your question and respond to it during the Q&A on Monday, December 6th. My thanks also to the organizers of PhilosophyCon. I'm really looking forward to going through the recorded talks and engaging with all the amazing and fascinating presentations this year. I hope you have a great rest of the convention.
Okay, we won't have last present. No, it seems not. Okay. Sir Francisco, we have a couple of questions for you. Let me get to it. The first one is about understanding how would you specify the process of creating the new technological transhumanistic field with the concept made by Dennett when he identified two different ways of how evolution and creating working organisms and systems works. The first one is bottom-up process, so the process represented by natural evolution. And the other one is in a concept of an intelligent projectant. So someone who has power of knowledge to create a highly complex system. And the question that we have is, are we able to start making changes in our perception by using different cybernetics and also technological advancements in a way that we are, for example, creating computers? Or are we not ready because of lack of time for evolution to get us to the stage when we can perceptually handle such a change?
Okay, that's a very interesting question, which unfortunately has no possible answer, not yet. I mean, perhaps in 3,000 years' time, I could reflect on it and let you know now. But right now, it's impossible to answer that. However, once I have said that, in this sense, you may have noticed in my presentation that I am a fan of Professor Marshall McLuhan. In that sense, Marshall McLuhan simply, what he does is to warn us that we have to be careful with technology, especially since the moment, technology is always, in his own terminology, our technologies are our extensions. But for the last, he would say 100 years, now we can say about 150 years, okay, the issue has been that technologies have become electric and electronics, and they are now capable of producing much more important changes in our own condition as what used to be called human being, okay, to the point that now we have evolved into a different type of being, which is precisely what is metaphorized in that short story, The Belonging Kind, that I have commented about. So the issue is that in this sense, and allow me to draw a link with a presentation of my younger colleague, in this sense, I would say that according to my age, I am rather pessimistic. I think that we have to be very careful with technology because it has created the bunch of non-people that now even see it in my classes. And when I tell them, you can use your smartphone when I tell you to do that, but meanwhile, please do not text your friends about whatever you think you want to tell them. Okay, so stop doing that in the class. You can do it later. But even although I tell them, they still keep on doing that. I always find 2 or 3 students who have been totally absorbed by the capacity of their smart phones and need to use them as if it had been a drug addiction. So in that sense, I could say, according to people my age, be very careful, because a new technological extensions are certainly changing us a lot. Now, according to the presentation on Cyberpunk, they are more optimistic, okay? But I hope that they are as optimistic as you two are, because you are very young. And for young people, we need young people to be optimistic. Yeah, you are very young, come on. And for young people, it is very important to be optimistic. And in that sense, I would like you to think that you still have the capacity to use the machines, to use those technological extensions for your benefit, and not to allow them to make you totally numb and therefore dumb, because if you become dumb, you will eventually drown, the same as happened to Narcissus. Okay.
Thank you very much for this answer. There's another question, and it starts with McLuhan concepts. So he presents a way of understanding how we culturally exchange information with this terminology of medium bias. But at the given moment, the medium bias just is over present in every interaction in social system. And do you think that, because now we live in this bias of internet communication, but do you think that it would be possible to regress a little bit, although I wouldn't like to use this word in this context, and to incorporate more of previous analog methods of exchange into the bias? Because I know sociologically it's how it is, but do you think that it might be a way to, for example, bring back the form of a letter, the written word, because it's a completely different way of expressing yourself and of understanding the world?
Yes, another interesting question. Well, once again, I have to go back to the idea of age. Okay, if you need to regress to analogical systems of communication, or even to writing letters, it means that you are a romantic. And you are a romantic in the sense that romanticism was very conservative. Okay, and I think that you can do it. To have a little romantic touch now and then in your life is wonderful. But our lives more and more depend on digitalization and on virtual reality, because eventually we are nothing. I hope I will not surprise you by stating something which is well known for almost 100 years now. Our matter, the matter of our bodies, is almost matterless. There is almost no matter in our bodies. Our cells, in our atoms, what we have is billions and billions of little particles orbiting around a nucleus. But matter, something that you touch, this is only electric pulses. As we are matterless, almost matterless, it's more than obvious that it's easier for the forthcoming being, which we already call the post-human being. It is easier to communicate in a form which is as matterless as possible. So you can still write a letter in paper, but you will be a romantic. You will be looking backwards, which I like it very much, but in general, society should go forward if we can. If there is a survivor, if there is a possibility of survival for the human being or the post-human being, we will go forward towards the more matterless, towards the virtual, towards the pure act of communication, because eventually we are only patterns of communication. But once again, another one of my sources wrote that in 1954. Okay, Robert Weiner said that we are patterns that abide, that change with the passing of time. You know as well that I don't know if it is every 8 years or every 10 years or so, our material cells have all changed. We are new matter only after a few years, all our cells have totally changed. So what is left in us that was there 20 years ago? Well, the only thing which is left is informational patterns, information, data. This is what we are eventually. So we are moving towards a manifestation, towards a more, inverted commas, perfect manifestation of that communication processes, which eventually is what forms us.
Once again, sir, thank you for this marvelous answer. And a follow-up question. Do you think that this moving forward, or how do you predict, would this forward movement to more and more matterless forms of existence and communication would eventually provide us with essential technology which is needed to fully transition into the non-wetware world.
Yes, yes, I think that, and this is already in Cyberpunk. In Cyberpunk, one of the big motifs is that you can eventually put your consciousness into a machine. And you know, if you see series such as Black Mirror, there are chapters dedicated to the fact that you can take your whole consciousness and to put it somewhere else. And then that famous sentence that I quoted from Neuromancer, the hacker, the person who surfaces the internet, by doing so is leaving his meat behind, his flesh, okay? But William Gibson wrote meat, living, you have to leave your corporality behind you, and you get into that. And certainly technology is already doing that. I would even say biotechnology, okay? That specific combination of biology and technology, they are already doing that. What I see as a problem could be that perhaps the social conditions of living in this planet would become worse and worse, especially in some parts of the planet. And then, of course, there is a typical danger, our politicians. Our politicians are basically ignorant people, and the only thing they do is to look for their own benefit. I'm not talking about your specific politicians in Poland or my specific politicians in Spain. I'm talking in general about the caste of politicians. Politicians are the new aristocracy. They have been progressively, they replaced the old nobility in Europe and in other different parts of the world. Okay, and the problem is that they are not well prepared for all these changes. They still have that horrid remnant of humanity, which is called hypocrisy and selfishness. And if we could better the condition of our politicians, I would say that the world would increasingly go to better results. But once again, who can say that this is going to happen? You may have noticed, if you know anything about history, that the ones who create wars are always the politicians. So the most huge nonsensical idea in the planet is that we still allow politicians to be in power without changing them or without demanding that to become a politician, what you need to be first is somebody who knows a little bit about human history, and they don't. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit pessimistic on the issue of politics.
That's fully understandable, so to say. Okay, do we have any more questions on YouTube, for example? Okay.
Well, I think I have two questions. The first one is, when I first heard about, I only know the basics of McLuhan's theory, but it's about different kinds of...
Mateusz, I think it's hard to hear you because of some microphone issues.
Very hard.
Maybe it's better to...
Is it better now?
A little better, a little bit better.
Okay. So at first glance, McLuhan makes sense to me. But then I think about things like the invention of writing. And Plato, for example, when he wrote about writing, he was very skeptical because it would erase human memory. It would be a form of amputation. And throughout our history, we've developed many similar inventions, not necessarily purely technological, not electrical. And we have changed as a species, but is it necessarily for the worse? And is it really an amputation? Maybe it's not moving up or down, forward or backward, but we're moving sideways, and it's just maybe it can't be measured as becoming less or more. Maybe it's just constant change that makes doesn't have a verifiable spectrum. cannot be measured. So I guess my real question is McLuhan necessarily right? Because I'm not convinced.
I'm not very sure I could understand you properly because I had difficulties listening to what you said. But I would say that, well, the notion of self-amputation, the problem with McLuhan is I don't know how he decided to write in such a cryptic way. So you need to read him and reread him and reread him. And one day you say, I understand what he means in this paragraph. And then the next day you say, no, not quite. Anyway, and I can certainly tell you what I have lately decided to think about the theory of self-amputation. Because he also mentions, well, not specifically writing would be obviously an extension of the self of man, as you know that he wrote man, meaning men and women, of course. But the idea would be that every extension of yourself means that you have to restructure what you already know, your capacities, okay? And to the usual example that I give my students is that a few years ago, the Finnish government decided, or the Department of Education in Finland decided that they were not going to teach in the school to their children handwriting anymore, because they just wanted them to be able to type and to use computers. Okay, that could be a process of self-amputation in that sense. You become more and more an expert in computing, but of course you had to amputate your skill capacity, your capacity for handwriting. In that sense, I think that possibly, if I could somehow supplement McLuhan here, okay, would be the fact that the self-amputation is not mathematical. I mean, it is not that I get 50 from a new skill and therefore I need to amputate 50 from my old skill. I wouldn't see that like that. But certainly the notion of self-amputation, if you take McLuhan aside, is a way to suggest that we are always changing, that we are always moving, and that as a species, the humans who are now definitely are very different from humans before the personal computer was invented, before the typewriter was invented, and the people when the typewriter was invented were already very different from the humanist scholars when the press was invented, and then the humanist scholars when the press was invented certainly were very different from our ancestors 2,000 years ago. And this is the idea, that your extensions around you make you different, because by using them, you always change something that you have inside you till that moment. You have to self-amputate one of your capacities to be able to use the new capacities, the new skills, the new extensions.
So I think we could call this process growing.
Yes, as well.
But amputation is
growing
certainly pessimistic.
Changing.
Yeah, changing. So I think McLuhan's terminology is pessimistic, and it's not necessarily so.
But prophetic as well. When you look at all the dumb people around you using the smartphone, you think, are they really using the smartphone, or is the smartphone using them?
Mateusz, you're muted.
Yeah. We are more and more dependent on technology, but I was just reminded of an old joke. There's a city, Wild West, there's a city and the boys playing with a stick and something. It doesn't really matter, but it's a very simple toy. and someone says, this technology is destroying our youth. They're going to be dumped as hell in a couple of years. I think it is in our nature to view future pessimistically, and maybe it is our strength because it warns us of certain dangers. But it doesn't mean every change is bad, I think. And the first impression many people get from reading McLuhan is that it's an inevitable doom that technology brings us. And I'm not even sure that was his intention.
For me, he was a seer, not necessarily pessimistic, but obviously what he wrote in many occasions can be understood as a warning about his future, which is our present.
Okay, thank you. So my second question is a bit more general. Lately, I've been discussing with my students the question of consciousness and psychophysical dualism, the Cartesian dualism, body and mind.
Oh, yes.
And I'm wondering, given the theories that you've mentioned, like the one that we're patterns of information, what's your stance on human consciousness? Are we mind or the body? Is it connected?
Honestly, I am among those people who think that the mind is part of the body. But of course, I know that we also developed in language another term for that, which is the brain. Okay. Is there any difference between the brain and the mind? I wouldn't be able to find any difference. Okay, it is the same as a sort of parallel issue here. You know that you can be a psychologist or you can be a psychiatrist, but both of them, psychologist and psychiatrist, can use psychoanalysis to try to help their patients. Well, it is the same thing. A psychologist used to be a philosopher. A psychiatrist used to be a medicine doctor, but eventually they use the same method to cure the patient. So I think that we have come right to the middle now, and that the Cartesian duality was good for its time, for the project of modernity, for emphasizing the wonderful human rationality. But that's it. We are past over the idea that human rationality is so good. I mean, we have created so many wars and we have come to so much destruction in the name of reason that in that sense as well, Descartes has been overcome. Okay. And anyway, as you know, cogito ergo sum, but why? This was never solved by Descartes. So he had to talk in terms of the figure of a God who would guarantee that he was not being cheated of his own existence. So this is a prime mover formulated by Aristotle. Descartes had not moved from Aristotle much. And in that sense, Descartes was clearly thinking in binary terms, either mind or body, whereas nowadays, I would say that the limits between mind and body are much more fluid. Okay, that would be Bauman, are much more fluid.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Thank you. Thanks to you. So,
right, I think that will be it, and we are ready to wrap up.
Okay. So once again, thank you very much for your invitation. It's been a very interesting experience. I also had to fight with my own technology, which I cannot control, as you can see. Somebody my age has it always difficult. Okay, thank you very much indeed.
Well, as you have said, we are young, but we are now with PhilosophyCon also struggling with technology sometimes. So I think it's just universal for our human nature.
All right.
Once again, thank you very much.
Thanks to you.
We wish you a pleasant evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Have a productive rest of the day, and perhaps we will see each other soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye. You should be online right now.
Oh, are we?
Yes, you are. Please, Casper, please introduce our guest, and I'll be checking the technical stuff.
Good morning. Good afternoon. It depends on the time zone. Ladies and gentlemen, today we have the pleasure of to welcome our another guest, Russell Noty, and he will be talking about writing cyberpunk. Simply, please begin.
So the last year I did this, I had a big presentation about like writing Lovecraft, and what it ended up being when we talked was you asking questions about like writing cyberpunk or writing Lovecraft. So like I am happy to talk about myself about writing cyberpunk, but honestly I would prefer to get any questions that you guys have, because I know it's been a long 3 days now talking about philosophy, and like I kind of want to come in and give you like a fun 30 minutes of like answering whatever questions you have. But I do have stuff prepared if necessary.
Okay, great. What exactly have you prepared? Because we might have a lot of questions, but we need a little push to the right direction to start.
Okay, so I'll just start and tell you sorry, I'm getting my tea for a second. I forgot to make it a little bit earlier. So like for me, the number one question that I think about when I think of cyberpunk is really, am I writing a utopia or a dystopia? Because to me, cyberpunk falls into the dystopia category. So and solarpunk falls into the utopia category, much in the same way of my main genre that I write is fantasy. So I think of grimdark, which is like Game of Thrones, or like Noble Bright, which is like Lord of the Rings. And so Game of Thrones is very like dark, gritty. Everything is like a moral gray area. Like people are like deceiving each other all of the time. Like that people have kind of ulterior motives, whereas like a Noble Bright book, there's at least one character who's doing the right thing for the right reasons. And moving that into sort of a cyberpunk / solarpunk, it's very similarly in cyberpunk. The most important thing is sort of like the conflict that you're up against with the government or the religious organization or whatever that organization is, whereas solarpunk is more like overcoming the flaws of humanity to like make a utopia. So I mean, questions like that, or I can just keep talking in that sort of vein as well, because I can talk about characters or settings or just like writing in general. I think last time when we did this feels like last year, but I think it was like 6 months ago, like y'all just had a lot of questions about like
time flows in quite a different way lately.
Yes, so like you guys just had questions about writing, so like I'm happy to answer questions about writing too if you guys have it. I have a feeling you guys have just done 3 days about analyzing cyberpunk and solarpunk and like what it means and what all of the philosophical ramifications are. So like, I mean, I'm up for whatever questions that you guys have, or like I said, I can just kind of talk a little bit more about writing it myself.
We were just having a presentation prepared by Ariel Croon, and she was talking exactly on the topic of understanding utopia and dystopia. And she talked also about cyberpunk, and sadly we couldn't have her personally to answer questions, but I have written down some thoughts. And I was, because solarpunk is very optimistic in its main premise. And I think that this optimism is quite short-sighted. Because when we are imagining change in technology and entire social, cultural, economical landscape, we should take into consideration that each move into each direction have some positive and negative aspects to it. And solarpunk is usually imagined, as I have personally come in touch with it, as kind of fantasy. It's very, very light wind, and there's not a lot of historical transition between what we have now with capitalistic ideology being the main discourse and just overshadowing everything else. And I would be very interested in hearing some of your thoughts on the way of possible transition and how it could be imagined in writing.
Sure. So I would push back on this in slightly, because you have to imagine that every book is part of an ecosystem. Like, they don't exist by themselves, and there's already a massive library of books that are dystopian, that imagine all of the bad things that the future could entail. And so one of the reasons I like solarpunk books is not because like they're generally I don't know, realistic. I don't know if they're not realistic or not, but like, I think they don't take into account the things that are happening now and the problems they take into account as, but I think that we need some optimism saying that we can get there, like to push against all of the negativity that like we are in this place that is like a rather nihilistic place. I think objectively, like if we just look at the world, like there's not like so a ton of hope of like what's going on in the future. So one of the things that solarpunk does is it imagines a world where like we actually get our stuff together. And I think one of the leaps that is very hard to have in this solarpunk battle is being able to imagine a world where we have gotten over all of the things that hold us back now. Very much like Star Trek. Like Star Trek is set hundreds of years past like the utopian ideal. And what solarpunk is trying to wrestle with is like the actual, how do we get to this ideal? The problem for me with solarpunk is more so they build this world of utopia and there's not much conflict in it. And so what I would love to see more in solarpunk is the ability to explore the ideas of optimism, but also like there are problems if there's going to be a utopia. Like there might be reactors that fail, or like there's all sorts of things that can happen in a utopian society that can still be optimistic. And I feel like the main failing of solarpunk specifically is they look at like this utopia as if like only good things can happen, when like bad things can also happen, but those things would just be different than they are in cyberpunk, where like everything is nihilistic. There's like there's always some big government or some big religion, or there's one big company that's controlling everything. And frankly, like that's probably not any more realistic either. You know, like you look at dystopia and you say like, okay, so for instance, there's this book called The Rule of One, where like all music has basically been outlawed. And you're like, how do you outlaw music? Like, that's just a ridiculous assumption. So like, I think that sometimes the grittiness of like cyberpunk and like the fact that it is often very, very like, is pushing the boundaries of what we already think of society will end up as, you end up with this world where like, a lot of things also don't make sense in cyberpunk, but like we are a little bit more forgiving of that. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And I think Mateusz wants to add something into conversation, but I have a follow-up thoughts, so we can return to it later. Mateusz, you're muted.
There's the thing with having two computers and a phone to operate at the same time. I get mixed. I was just clicking my computer screen, which isn't a touch screen, so it didn't make sense. Anyway, what you said there, I don't think when you watch cyberpunk movies or read cyberpunk novels and so on, there's this internal conflict. Basically, you always get into it knowing what to expect. There's an individual, there's a system. They need to come into conflict. I haven't read anything solarpunk, and honestly, I'm not sure what's. I've heard a lot about solarpunk the past few days and last year as well. Last edition, but I'm not sure. Still not sure what's a representative title for the genre that is like emblematic for solarpunk. So that's my first question. If you have anything worth seeing to mention or reading, and the second thing is, I've just after watching a couple of adaptations of H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, I finally read the story. And I've realized that the story I always found simplistic is actually quite balanced. And this is what I always find missing both in solarpunk, in cyberpunk and similar stories. If there's a utopia, there should always be an underbelly. And if there's this kingdom of sad people, there should be some light hidden somewhere. And what I'm trying to say is I've grown to appreciate the classic sci-fi story. And what I'm wondering is, how is it possible that such a long time ago we had balanced stories that showed such a simple concept, but in such a varied way. And nowadays it seems like it's either nihilistic or utopian. I mean, have we gone simpler with our sci-fi? What's your opinion on this?
So I'm looking up the Solarpunk wiki right now just to see if any of the things that I think of are like that will be like Solarpunk optimism would be are in here. One of the ones they actually put in this Wikipedia is Dune. I'm not sure Dune is solarpunk, but like they do put it in here. The problem with solarpunk is it's a very new genre, so there's very little about it. My friend writes a very good book series called Plastic Girl, which is eco-punk, which is very similar to solarpunk, except that it focuses more on like ecology and like rebuilding the natural world than it does like on like the technology part of it. To answer your second question, I think that everything has become very polarized and very simplistic, unfortunately, and it's part of it's partially the fact that everything has become a monopoly. And so like there's very few like large companies that are willing to do anything that buck any trends or put any money into into anything that goes against anything that's popular before. But I think that what ends up happening is people want the thing that's popular. And so people start saying, oh, I'm just going to make that very, very popular thing again and again and again and again and again. And they start making like Maze Runner and Hunger Games. And suddenly a genre like dystopian will be said to be dead. But like, it's not dead. It's just like everyone is trying to make the exact same book that happened before. I think that what happened in the 1800s and then earlier 1900s with things like A Brave New World and The Time Machine is there was just less structure of what a book could be to be successful. And on some level, like we need that, like we need to get more books that could just be like anything. I have a book called Worst Thing in the Universe, which is narrated by God set in the distant future and deals with like karma and cyberpunk and like all of this like very heady concepts. And like nobody buys it ever. People want to buy like my like very more straightforward fantasy thrillers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I think that one of the things that happens when you are homogenize the social media landscape and the advertising landscape is there's fewer avenues to get those kind of other books out into the mainstream. Like for instance, my friend's Plastic Girl book, like I don't know a comp for it that's popular. Like I don't have any comp for it. But like if you came to me with a dystopian cyberpunk like Blade Runner type book, well, I could tell you 50 comps for that book. And if I went to tell you, hey, if you like Blade Runner, I'd say, hey, I have a book like Blade Runner, but like, here's the twist. It just becomes a lot easier for me to sell that book. And we've become much more, books have become much more commercial. Like authors are making a living doing books in a way that they never have before on a mass level. And that's great. But one of the things that is lost in that is that people no longer just write weird books for the sake of writing weird books. It's always writing a book with the idea to sell it or to monetize it or something. Whereas people that like Kurt Vonnegut, who worked at a college his whole life, like he just wrote the weird books that he wanted to write, and like some of them were popular, some of them were not popular, some of them hit on. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with like this need to monetize everything, but then there's the other problem where there's probably a lot of really cool books, but like we don't know about it because the things that are getting marketed are the things that are popular, and then the people are doing books that are popular and they're marketing those other books. So I think that it also takes some like research on our parts to find these weirder books that do deal with these concepts. The problem with that being like, it's very hard to have a conversation with somebody that like has not read a book or in a very small fandom. And I do wish there were more weird things that broke through, but I mean, I don't know, that's like 5 or 6 reasons for you. Like, I think that I wish that more writers took more chances on like books that were weirder. I wish that like the audience was more prepared for things like that. And I think we can do that by the great thing about dystopian books or like cyberpunk books is like they imagine a future that we can already see. Like we can see a world where like social media takes over, or like a big corporation takes over, or like a government does X, Y, and Z, because like what cyberpunk does is it has a thread line of like making just what is happening now worse. The thing with solarpunk is it's the opposite. It's like it's taking concepts that are like clean energy that like does not really cut on, and like imagining a world where it does catch on. So it's part of that is also it's harder to get somebody to be like, hey, let's imagine a world where like corporate interests are not the thing that overtakes the day, and like we actually can like get solar power to be, and it's just a lot harder thing to imagine. I don't know, does any of that make sense or resonate with?
It certainly resonates with me, because when we were talking about the weird stories, the first thing that came to my mind is Lovecraft, of course, because he didn't care about money at all. I mean, he was committed to writing as much as he could. And also I thought about Ichabod Crane, because I've read a couple of issues. It is a weird story, certainly. By the way, is it one of your more popular ones?
So Ichabod is my most popular comic book. But what happens with Ichabod is like I ended up going everywhere. Like I went 100, 200 shows with this book, and like I spent 10 years building it so that it had an audience. And I think that also what's weird about authorship is people are so worried about the front catalog being the book that comes out now, like the next book that comes out. And they're so focused on that. They don't look at the back catalog of which is the books that they've already put out. And I think that is such a weird thing, which also fuels into this ability to like find an audience for weird books, because weird books, you have to go and you have to find little niches. You have to go to conventions. You have to like talk at things like this. You have to like dig and dig and dig to find the audience. And Ichabod took literally 10 years for it to become our best-selling book. The beautiful thing about these weird books, though, is once they find an audience, that audience is like very, very like attached to the book, because there's nothing else like it. So they're harder to find. So it's much easier to sell my book, Katrina Hates the Dead, because it's this beautiful Marvel style book. Like you can understand the concept very easily. But with Ichabod, like it's very weird. Like it's not easy to understand. Like it takes probably 5 or 6 issues to really get into it. You can't just be like, hey, a girl beats up demons and then goes to kill the devil. Like it's not a book that is easily consumable. So what ends up happening is that book has a very low ceiling, which is the maximum number of books that it will sell. But those people that love that book, like will devour it forever. And so part of this idea of like writing solar punk books or writing the off-market books is you're going to have maybe 1,000 or 2,000 people that buy that book at maximum, but those people are going to be devoted to your book so deeply that they're going to follow everything that you do.
So keeping in mind that you definitely have a trick, maybe not a trick, but a way of influencing the audience, convincing them to bond with your writing. How do you write cyberpunk while also trying to escape the banality, or is it a commercial thing? Because we're supposed to be talking about writing cyberpunk.
So my rule, so the rule with writing pretty much anything is you want about 85% of stuff that people can already understand immediately. And then 15% of, this is writing fantasy, especially, but sci-fi as well. 15% of things can be wild, outlandish concepts. And so the goal really is to find the anchor in cyberpunk or solar punk. It's like, okay, what are the things that are happening in this book that my audience will automatically be able to relate to? Like, is it that the television screens are like everywhere? Is it that like a big corporation runs everything? Is it that social media has taken over? Like whatever it is. So it's sort of, and in both of them is sort of taking what is now and projecting forward where we're going to be in 20, 30, 50 years. Not the reason that, and most cyberpunk is near term, which is like 10, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years in the future. Because if you get sort of getting 100 years in the future, it starts, audiences start being like, I don't understand what is going on here. So most of the cyberpunk is like 20, 30, 40 years in the future. And then it's projecting, okay, what, and solar punk would be the same thing. What terrible thing, what ills am I trying to talk about in this story? Like, what am I, like with H.G. Wells, it was the overreaching of government, or with Brave New World, it was like the horrors of a utopian society that is really like destroying everything else. Foundation kind of similarly in that way. So you have to like kind of figure out what your ethos is. Like, what is the thing I'm trying to talk about? And then how do I do that in a way? And what elements am I going to bring forward in a way that people can understand? And you're like, let's say you make a list of 8 of those. And then you say, okay, what new concepts am I going to understand? Am I going to introduce to these people in this book? And you make a list of all of those. And one of the things you can do, for instance, in a series is that 15% is additive. So in book 1, you're kind of bringing in a little bit, but then in book 2, you can bring in even more. In book 3, even more. So I'll give you an example from my series, God's Verse Chronicles, which is fantasy, but it kind of explains this idea. Is you as the first book that we did, the first book was Greek mythology, was Judeo-Christian mythology. It was about the apocalypse and God and demons and kind of demonology. And then we moved to, and then the next book was Greek and Roman mythology. And we added in Norse mythology in book 3. And then book 4, we added in more demonology. And then so we slowly added in it with each book, like a little bit of information that the audience probably wouldn't know. But then by the 5th or 6th book, like it's bananas. Like, you have like Greek gods and Norse gods and Hindu gods and Buddhist god, and like they're all in this kind of cavalcade together. So what I would recommend if you're trying to put together these very weighty concepts and like make a really weird book is you should think about, maybe what can I do? Like, if I want to introduce this book, that if we are here and the concept I really want to introduce is like here, how many books do I need to get to this weighty concept? Now, the other option you can bring is just say, I don't care about any of that, and be like, here's all the stuff I want to do, and I know very few people are going to read it, but like, I don't care. I don't care who reads it. I just want to make it. So to go back to my book, Worst Thing in the Universe, like, again, it's a cyberpunk futurist book that's narrated by God, set in the distant future, and like deals with like basically the existential, like his existential dread of creating humanity, basically, in the whole book, and like the problems of that we face in the world today, like that. And that's a book that like people who read it, they say almost unanimously like it's one of their favorite books. But like I didn't want to write 10 books in that series. I just wanted to write one. So you kind of have to then say, okay, I'm going to take all of these weighty concepts and put them in a book, and then I'm just going to go places that I think that this book would work. So for instance, we talked about this before. I said I have a free gift of like this book, The Worst Thing in the Universe. If you go to russellnolte.com/worst, you can just read it for free. And I've been doing that because like this is a philosophy convention about cyberpunk, and I talked about Lovecraft last time, and like I think you guys would grok the book. I think you would like it. Like so part of it is saying, okay, how can I make sort of a mass market book that slowly gets weirder, like Dresden Files, for instance. Sorry, my examples are very fantasy. I'm mostly a fantasy author, but I do write some cyberpunk. Like Dresden Files, the first book is very like urban fantasy. It's very much like a Buffy episode. And then, but by book like 8 or 9, he's like riding a dinosaur through like downtown, like shooting like laser beams out of like, so like books can get weirder over time as a series. So you can choose that approach and say, I'm going to make a series that explores all of these themes. Or you can say, this book might have 2,000 people who will ever read it and enjoy it, but like, that's good enough for me. Like I'm trying to influence people with this single book, and I'm looking for people who are a little bit more highbrow in their thinking, or they want to explore these concepts. And the nice thing about writing today, I talked about kind of the negatives of writing today. The positives of writing today is there's 7 billion people in this world, and you have access to most of them. So you can like legitimately build an audience for these weirder books. You just have to be willing to drill down and get and find them.
Thank you. Great answer. I will think about it for some time. And I have one final question, but since I've been hogging all the time, I will give some time to Kasper and Zuza if they have any questions, and then I will come back with the final one, if it's okay.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Mateusz. I have a question, because you seem to talk quite a lot about the importance of bringing those concepts, those fully created words, to the public, no matter how large or small the public is. And I was wondering, when we have cyberpunk, it has really gotten its way into the pop culture. And we have been talking about, for example, Dune a lot during this conference. And it's a science fiction movie with a great budget, with great technical and methodical support behind it. And it has a great influence over historically creating the cultural vision. And I would like to ask you if you can imagine that we would start to make motion pictures based on solarpunk, to bring this concept even closer to the general public, because it is a way of getting some place to start talking about the possibility of this world, of ever creating this world. Because as you said, because I asked about this way of getting there, and you said that it's important to first realize that there's somewhere we can get, and it's a start figuring out how to get there. And which favorite pics of yours would you choose to make motion pictures based on out of Solarpunk books?
All right, I'm going to be honest. I don't really have a favorite Solarpunk book that I would make. And this, I don't think there's one that is plot driven enough to make a movie about. I think that we're still looking for like a story set in this utopia, in this utopian ideal, or moving towards this utopia that doesn't exist in my lexicon yet. What I would love to see is a series that, or a movie that is about moving towards this utopian ideal, because I think that we have these books that are set in this utopia. And I would love to see something that's like, I don't know, 3 or 5 years before this utopia happens, or like before all of this stuff actually happens, that is not cynical. Because so many of these things that are happening about like making the world better are like happening from this very cynical place. And most media is frankly very cynical. Like, I think that people, it's very easy to be cynical with the world. Like, I think people's the strongest emotion is fear. So playing on that is very easy. I think that in order for something that's Solarpunk to work, we're gonna have to find something that is much more plot driven and much more like narratively interesting. Unfortunately, I don't want to insult Solarpunk, because I think that this is very much like the dawn of a new genre, and a lot of times people just don't have the language of the genre yet and how to translate it. A lot of Cyberpunk at the beginning is very messy also. Like, it's very messy as people are trying to figure out like how to combine world with story and character and do this in a way that like you could get Blade Runner or something like that. And I think we're very much in the first like throes of this. Not that there hasn't been Solarpunk stuff for a long time, but I think we're not quite in a world where people can accept that a utopia is even possible. And I think before you can have like a mass media like piece, you have to have the understanding among society that like it's even possible. And like, I don't know how you turn a society around to want to feel hopeful, but I am hopeful that people are getting burnt out on the dystopian, everything is terrible all of the time stuff. The reason I love Solarpunk, and I will defend it even if I don't think that any books have been brilliant yet, is because to me, it's very easy when things are going well to say things are going, when things are going badly, to say things are going badly. It's that sort of like in the 90s when things were going well, the most punk thing to do was like say no, like there's all these flaws in the system, like there's all these people who are not getting ahead, there's all these people that are being left behind. And now like everything is horrible. And I think the most punk thing you can do is to shed hope on the world, like to shed that there are these good things, there are these concepts and these things that are going well or that could go well. So the thing that I love about Solarpunk is like, to me, that's punk. Like punk is going against what the general narrative of the universe is. And the general narrative of the world right now is very cynical. And I'm very excited about stories that show that like good people with good intentions can actually change things, because otherwise we're just playing into the narrative that everything's bad and like nothing will ever change. I don't know if that answers your question, but I don't have a list. I'm waiting for it. I'm waiting for the one that I'm like, that's the one.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how you are depicting this historically, like the literature analysis of this formation of the entire genre of cyberpunk and comparing it to the current state when we could have such a blossom of ideas, words, and and influence on our culture growing through out of this seed that solar punk is.
Yeah, I mean, like how much, like how many more times can I hear things are bad? Like, I don't need to hear that anymore. Like, I get it. Like, things are bad. Like, things are bad. How do we change it for the better? And like, I think that, to me, that is the beauty of what solar punk could be.
Yeah, exactly. It's I think cyberpunk is getting out of ideas now. It got really massive into, it was brought into culture, into pop culture in all mainly possible ways. And even in games, I think there can be so much of general gaming word interest in it, and then it will be moved to a niche, and something else will take the main narrative.
Well, the thing is, I mean, the thing with Cyberpunk is that like it was about like computers, like supercomputers and like tablets and like all of these cool things that were like futuristic, and now like it's reality. Like they haven't had, Cyberpunk hasn't had much advancement in the last 40 years of like the ideas that they have dealt with. And like, to its credit, like it was so prescient that like Cyberpunk became kind of reality. But like, I also would love to see a world where like Cyberpunk like deals with new pieces of it. There's some that deal with AI, and I think that's kind of cool. But like, to me, futurism is like what solarpunk is talking about now, because like that is the leap. Like that is a leap of like where we could be. And I think that in the 70s and 80s, cyberpunk predicted like a lot of what we have now, good and bad. And I think that, and this is nothing against cyberpunk, just like, and I'm sure that someone would be like, no, that's not true. Like there are all these new things that cyberpunk is talking about, but like, I haven't read cyberpunk that deals with a lot of this new stuff. There, a lot of it is skating on a lot of the things that were 70s, 80s, and 90s cyberpunk. And what I loved about cyberpunk when I was a kid was this idea of like what the world will become. Like we'll have flying cars, or we'll have like supercomputers that like are in your ear, like all of these cool things. And now when I read cyberpunk, most of the time, like, oh, like this is just like next Tuesday, like this is going to be like 5 years from now, like we're there. And this is nothing against cyberpunk again, but like why I think ecopunk and solarpunk are so exceptional ideas is because I can imagine a world where like that all exists, but I have no idea how to get there. And in the same way that I was like, oh, I understand how like you could take this MacBook 2E with a green screen and like turn it into like a personal computer, like in your hand. Like I have no idea how to do that, but like I get it. Like I get the leaps. I get that there's a world that can happen. And I liked that about cyberpunk. I mean, I enjoy the dystopian nihilism of cyberpunk also a lot of times, but what I really loved about it was, oh, like here is what the world could be. Like there could be androids that do X, Y, and Z. Like I don't know how we get there, but now I kind of do know how we get there, because like we're there, we're almost there. We're getting to the cusp of these things. And now when I think of like, okay, what is 50 years? Yes, I can predict and say the world is going to end, but like, that's not really good. It's not really good writing. Like I want to know for this kind of thing, what I think cyberpunk, I hope, can find, but what solarpunk is doing is, and ecopunk is doing, is saying, here is the thesis. My thesis is, here is what 50 years in the future is going to look like. And we're going to have wind turbines that power everything. And like, it's going to be like this utopian society that like there's power. And I'm like, well, that sounds ridiculous. Like, I don't know how to get there, but like, I can imagine a world where like we go from the small amount of in America, at least a small amount of like solar power that exists, to like being able to do that, to have everyone have solar power and have like, and I can see a world where that happens. And I like reading about scenarios where like where I don't know how we get there, but I can picture it, because like that's the Star Trek, right? Like that's the Star Trek like utopia of like that's what, like, it showed people reaching for the future, showed people saying, oh, you can have a transport in your hand. Like, I want to say that, like, people devoted their whole lives to like having a palm like communicator in their hand and like all of these things. And I like reading books in science fiction that take that idea and make me think, oh, yeah, I have no idea how this happens, but like, wouldn't it be really cool if, like, I don't know, all of our cars ran on oxygen or whatever? And anyway.
Yes, thank you. I was going to ask one more question, but you kind of already gotten through. Yeah, but what I really like is this idea that cyberpunk is becoming irrelevant from this simple reason that it is tomorrow. It is happening, and we can see that it's not happening in this way. So it's just being left behind in history. So we will have this, what is going to happen after 50 years from now, and we will need to fill it with something. And ecopunk and cyberpunk, solarpunk, might be those pieces that we can actually use to make some change.
Yeah, and I think that you can. So what I would say for Solarpunk, for anyone thinking about writing it, is I would love to see a world that, like, there are problems in utopias. Like, it doesn't have to be this idea that like Brave New World, where like there's a utopia, but like half of the society is leeching off like the very rich are leeching off like everyone else. Like, it can be a world where like things are good, but like there are problems. Like, maybe there are people that like there's still going to be conflict there. And I think that Solarpunk does a really good job of imagining the future, but I think they are much too rosy in the idea that like many people will get along in that future, and like there won't be geopolitical issues in the future, and like there won't be technology that breaks down, or like, for instance, like we can be in phase 1 of a utopia, but like working towards phase 2. Like maybe we have all of people's like basic needs covered, but, or like maybe we have everyone's power covered, but like we haven't fixed like people like being able to like fixing world poverty or something. And so there are all these stages to these utopias. And I think that Solarpunk historically has taken this idea that like we're at a perfect utopia, like it's perfect utopia and there's very little conflict. But I would love to see like that, like the power, like I don't know, like I can't even think of the problems that you would have in that right now, but like there are all sorts of levels to utopia, and there are all sorts of conflicts that can have there. And just because we are in a utopian idea does not mean there's not bad things that happen. I think that the ideal for utopia is that whoever the main characters are, or the majority of players, are working towards a better future with optimism instead of with cynicism, which is like, I think that what a dystopian ideal would be. And also, just because you have a utopia doesn't mean everyone is perfectly like balanced in that utopia either. So that will be my hope for like a Solarpunk novel that deals a lot with the societal implications of a utopia and the conflicts that arise between people in a utopia, but with the ideal that we're still working towards utopia together, instead of this sort of like pie in the sky, it's a utopia and there's no problems. Because I mean, even to go back to the time machine, like even when they went forward in the future and they had a utopia, there were still problems in that utopia. It just were different than what we would imagine. And what I would love is you're taking us forward. You're taking us forward 50 years and showing us there's going to be a utopia. Also show us like what the problems would be, so we can sort of work those problems into the world now. Because when we watch Solarpunk or read Solarpunk, a lot of times it's like, yeah, well, yeah, this is cool. Like you've now solved all of the world's problems, but like I don't believe that there's not going to be conflict. And I think if we can add some of that conflict back into it, like you would have something a lot richer for anyone who's thinking about writing Solarpunk or writing it right now.
Okay, thanks. I know we're out of time, and I would like to apologize in advance to the next speakers, which are also our guests from the last edition. But I've been dying to ask you this question for a couple of weeks now. I'm going to write a book about Norse mythology next year. And since you know the topic, do you have any advice on how to approach it?
I mean, it really comes down to the character that like, is it going to be like, who is the main character, the gods, or the main character is humanity? And so that's the first question that I would say is, and then step two, is it epic fantasy, or is it like more urban fantasy, or is it space fantasy in the future? So those two questions you kind of have to ask before you can even set a book anywhere. There was a cool book that I read called The Song Weaver's Vow, I think it's called, which was about a Greek woman who got sacrificed to Norse gods and had to like then tell Greek myths to them, which I thought was like a really cool idea. So the third piece is like, what is the twist on the Norse mythology? Is it like, what are you trying to say? So in my books, in my Gods vs. Chronicles, the gods are a replacement for the rich in capitalism who don't care about the humanity, who is everyone else who's not the rich. It's all the rich. So gods are rich and powerful and they have their own like delights. And so my even though I'm using the Greek gods and the Egyptian gods and all of these people, it's really a story about like rich versus poor and like how like the poor can rise up and like and have a stake in their own fate. Like, so like, what is the point you're trying to make with the Norse mythology things? I have friends that tell like romance stories with Norse gods and goddesses. I have friends that tell like action adventure stories, urban fantasy stories. You know, the Thor like losing his power and coming to mortality is a good, but you know, Norse mythology is such a rich tapestry that like I would, and there's been so much done with it. I would kind of figure out the allegory, I guess. So like you're using Norse mythology as an allegory for what, and then hopefully everything else will fall into place. And just don't forget the Norse myths were like all gender fluid and like all like crazy, like all like wonderfully like odd and weird, as well as like being these like great fighters as well. So like don't necessarily make all of the gods like these perfect representations of what they are. The beautiful thing about mythology is you can use the same myths and legends and fairy tales to tell stories that are relevant for the time. So I guess, how are you reinventing the mythology to tell a story that is relevant to people in 2022 or 2023? I don't know. Those are my like general thoughts on how to use any mythology.
Yeah, great points. Thank you. But I'm still hoping this is just a prelude to a longer conversation. I think I'll try to reach you at some other time. Thank you for joining us. It was great, as always. I think this is going to be a tradition. And one more thing, if you would like to stay with us on Zoom for the final panel, you're welcome to do so. If you have some things to do, like eat breakfast or anything.
I would like to eat breakfast. I would just like to say thank you. I look forward to the next one. And if you guys would like to read my weird book on fate, the universe, and God and religion and cyberpunk, you can go to russellnolte.com/worst and download it for free.
We actually got some cool promo materials from some other authors this edition, and I think we'll print something out and we'll just include it in our package.
Awesome. So sounds good. I'll send you a link.
Yeah, great.
All right.
Thank
bye,
you,
everyone. Have a great day. Bye.
Bye.
And now for the final attraction of the 7th edition of PhilosophyCon. Welcome, Andres. Welcome, Josefa. How are you doing?
Hi, can you hear me? Is everything okay?
Yeah.
Hello, guys.
Okay.
I'm good. Thank you for the invitation again, and very happy to be here. Hello, Jojan. Hello, Mateusz. Michael, Michael, I don't know how to pronounce it. Certainly, I'm pronouncing it wrong.
My name is Kuza, and that's Kacper.
Yes, hello.
Yeah,
Casper,
Michał is someone completely different, actually, but
We're using different computers.
yeah. But
Yeah,
it also
Polish
helps
is
a lot.
not my language of my knowledge, so excuses.
No problem.
No problem, your excuse. Anyway, the thing is, we are going to start this panel right now, but we cannot share your video directly via Zoom for some reason. So I will switch to another mode of streaming, and I would like to ask you to just watch it on YouTube, if there's not a problem. We can send you a link to our stream, and after we're done with Andres' video, we will listen to Josefa's talk. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself because Kacper and Zuza are supposed to introduce you first. So.
Okay.
Are you ready, guys? Kacper, Zuza?
Yes, we have some technical issues.
Shoot.
Okay. One moment.
Okay.
Okay, so we will start. First one. Okay, so we are really happy that you join us, and we would like to hear some words, some reflection from Josefa Pawliczkowa on the topic Parable of a 21st Century, Octavia Butler's dystopian vision in literature and reality.
Yes, thank you for inviting me at first. So am I going to start? Am I getting it correctly? Now?
Yes, moment. Okay. Is it?
Oh, please go ahead, Jojan. I'd be very happy to listen to your talk.
Okay, I'll try to share the presentation. Let's do it this way. Can you see my screen?
Not yet.
No, sadly.
And not yet. Oh, Jesus. This way, maybe.
Okay,
Yeah,
now.
now we can see.
Okay, perfect. Fine. So. This is it. Okay. So when I've read the abstract and the call for presentations for this year's PhilosophyCon, it was actually the first thing that came to my mind. Octavia Butler's dystopian novels, The Parable of the Sower and The Parable of Talents. And as I've read it recently, it came to me that the dystopian future it visions came very close to our reality. So I've decided to take a closer look on similarities between this literary fiction and our reality, and whether there is also some chance for solution or for prevention of this dystopian future or not. So first of all, why the parable of the 21st century? And what are we going to talk about? The first thing is what does it mean, the dystopian future? What future is it that Butler describes? Then I would like to show you where the fiction and the reality merge or touch together. And then I would like to go to shift from the pessimistic vision to some optimistic solutions, or to something that Butler's novels could provide to us as a solution. And at the end, I would like to think about whether this solution can be considered a new religion, maybe, or just some prophetic literary vision, or something else. So when talking about Butler's parable series, we have to know that it was intended to be 6 novels in this series. However, she only managed to publish 2 of them, The Parable of the Sower in 1993 and then The Parable of Talents in 1998. The other 4 novels or ideas or concepts of them remained unfinished and unpublished due to Octavia Butler's mental block and her early death. However, these stories are about the future, which is set in the United States in year 2024, so not very far from us. And it describes life and journey of Lauren Olamina, the main character at the time, 15-year-old, who strives and struggles to survive in a new world that came to exist in these books, and who tries to find a solution on how to survive in this world. And she creates a fictional religion she calls Earthseed, and which she collects in the so-called fictional Book of the Living. Throughout the novels, you can see several excerpts and quotations from this Book of the Living, from the religion of Earthseed, which gradually constitute one concept or idea or religion, or some maybe instruction on how to survive in this fictional world. However, when we come to description of the fictional world, of the dystopia, as you can see, it's really not very far away from what we are experiencing now. There are several ecological or climatic issues which we already know very well, such as energy and water crises, and maybe wildfires, and also climatic migration, which is already happening. However, it is not only the ecology or the environment and nature that should be our concern, but also Butler depicts a crack in the social order we know now as humanistic and democratic, because there's a salary gap that is widening, creating more social classes falling into poverty. Also, there's a huge danger of debt slavery, and something we can in general call the crisis of humanism, where individuals try to protect themselves, but also close themselves in small enclaves, stick only to their relatives and closest people, and do not care for the general well-being, maybe, or for the well-being of the civilization as such. And well, my initial question was, when preparing this presentation, if this part of Butler's fiction has come so close to our reality, is there any option for her fictional religion to do the same? Is there any option for us to find a realistic solution in a fictional book, in a belletry? So this is where Earthseed comes to stage. I've mentioned that Butler called it a religion, but we can argue whether it is not better to be considered maybe a philosophy or ideology, or maybe even an individual stance or some kind of movement, maybe grassroots movement. Well, what it is, first of all, is impressive mixture of philosophical ways and ideas. because Octavia Butler created a really interesting blend of two philosophies. On one hand, we can see ideas of pre-Socratic thinker Heraclitus of Ephesus, who considered change to be the main concept or the main principle of the functioning cosmos, and who described the change or transformation as an ever-going process, as a cycle of transformation, which touches everything, in which everything changes, and not only by itself, but also these changing things influence their surroundings and also change their surroundings. He described it, and Socrates did this after him, as a cosmic flow of things, of something that is never stopping, of a cycle of life and death, where each life ends in death, but each death means a new beginning, a cycle which always repeats themselves, but only in a greater measure in terms of Christianity. And she changes the main leading principle from the characteristic, the typical. Okay, what did you hear the last? Okay, sure. I was saying that even though Butler took change as the main functioning principle of the universe, she didn't only leave humanity with this understanding, but she also provided humanity. Okay. Socrates said that he agreed with Heraclitus that everything flows, that there's a cosmic flow of time and universe as such. But Octavia Butler didn't stop on this notion, on this understanding that change is something constant, that change is everlasting and is always here. But she also provided people with some kind of manual or instruction on how to deal with this understanding, on how to deal with this information. And for this manual or advice, she reached to Christian on values and humanistic values, which are nowadays actually intertwined closely. However, there was a change in this in her understanding of Christianity as such, and the change happened on the top place actually. What she did was that she united God and changed, and she promoted change to be the main principle, the leading thing that should lead us in our life. It is something that Marcus Borg called a spiritual model of religion, where the shift can be best visible. He understood the classical Christianity as a monarchical model, and he explained that this monarchical model understands the Christian God as distant, omnipotent, and majorly male figure, which is omnipotent, omnipresent, is always here, and who has given the universe a beginning and the end. So it's a God that gave humanity 10 commandments, and who decides how to behave, how to worship him. And he also decides that there are some people who are good according to him, obedient, and some that are disobedient, who are bad. And this monarchical model also creates this way some kind of dichotomy. It creates two groups of people, those good and those bad. And in terms of humanity, it's always the tension between us and them, between our and alien or different, which not only grows in cultural power, but also it can be transformed into a political tension and power. And this is what Borg and also Butler saw as not fit for the changing world we live in. not fit for the dystopian world she depicted. And so she leaned closer to the spiritual model of religion, which said that God doesn't have any anthropomorphic character, that it is maybe more of a essence or something present everywhere and at all times, something that guides us, maybe something as a moral, ethical compass, which should help us to overcome obstacles and to find our way in this new world. And now, as these two philosophies merge, the spiritual Christian model and the pre-Socratic philosophy of Heraclitus, this is how the earth seed is established. This is the merging, the key point in which it merges, in which it connects and creates a new notion of world. And in this mode, in this understanding of earth seed, Butler said that God is change. She said that, and by this claim, by this phrase, she also illustrated that it would not be appropriate and it would be very futile to passively worship something like change. But to worship it, we have to acknowledge it, to approach it actively, and to shape change, and to try to use it to live our world better. So it is not only this philosophical clash of ideas we can see in Earthseed and in Butler's novel, but it is also represented by a generational clash or a generational gap, because the generation of Lauren Olamina's parents is in the novel described as the worshippers of the traditional Christian God too. It is the generation that looks backwards nostalgically, which remains passive, which worships a God, but does nothing to reach maybe paradise or to live a good Christian life actively. It's also the generation that expects the good old times of 1990s maybe to return on its own, or they expect that someone else will save them. And this is criticized heavily by Lauren and the generation of hers, which are the young adults actually. This new generation actually claims that this stability or maybe even rigidity of their parents' generation is not suitable anymore for a changing world. And what is better to do is to adapt to the changes and to understand that nothing can actually stay stable or stay the same. And that doesn't only work for the world, but also for the religion, because the old ways cannot save humanity. It has to adapt and find new ways of existence in this ever-changing world, in the world where there is the ongoing climatic crisis and the social crisis and so on. There's also one special thing about Lauren, that she's a carrier of a supernatural ability called hyperempathy. The hyperempathy is described as her ability to experience the emotional and sensual experience of other people. And this also can be seen a symbol as Earthseed, as this new way of thinking about change, because it means that you can't close yourself off from the others. It cannot be just you against the world, and that there is no tension, no fight between two groups, between you and the world. You have to unite. You have to understand each other empathically. You have to work together to create something better, a better world, for example. I've picked some quotes from the Earthseed that manifest these ideas I've shared with you. The first one is actually the most often cited, and it represents a key to understand the whole earth seed. It says, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. This is a representation of the pre-Socratic ideas that everything flows, that everything flows in a great cycle where life turns to death and death then turns to life, that nothing remains untouched by change, nothing remains stable and unchanged. And this quotation also provides us with a key to literal understanding of Earthseed, because when you use words God and change interchangeably when reading the other tenets, you can see the whole philosophy of Earthseed unravel in front of you. The second quote then, belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing, can be also seen as a criticism of the old ways of worshipping, of belief or a religion. And it also returns us back to the generational gap, to the idea that passive worshipping does nothing. It is action and adaptation, improvisation, or some progress role that can bring us something new or better. The third quote then, here the change in words can be applied actually. So when you change God for change, you can see the philosophy as it was intended. So if we read it as change is neither good nor evil, neither loving nor hating, change is power, good is change, we must find the rest of what we need within ourselves, in one another, in our destiny. This is the call, and the call to action, and it can also be seen as a subversion of the traditional notion of God, because the traditional role of God was that of judge, of someone deciding who is good or who is worthy or unworthy, who should be sent to paradise and who should be then to hell. And this idea is subverted by something that is naturally true, that change as such, change as a phenomenon, is indifferent to people. It is something that that influences us all, but which can be shaped as such. Well, and the fourth tenet then, it explains actually, or it further develops these ideas and provides us with clear instructions on how to deal with change, how to deal with life and adaptation, how to still keep discovering new things, learning, teaching, how to take care of people, of community, how to work and progress together. But now, as we have gone through this philosophical and religious thinking or explanation, we have come to something that to a question that I have asked at the beginning. So if the dystopian world is so close to our reality, is this philosophy of Earthseed something that can be used in our reality, in our world? Or is there any way how to define it or how to approach it so that it could be used in the future? That is it. Can it be considered a plea for change in our world? Well, yes, of course, but we have to admit that our reality is, the real world is very complicated, and that there are many pleas for change. There are many movements that are trying to change us or change the progress, the evolution of society. So it may not be enough. However, it may also not be functional if we take a look on it as an individual stand or just a personal ideology. On one hand, this could be applicable because many people sharing the same ideas have potential power to change something bigger in the world. And yet they remain unconnected by official rigid rules of a specific community. But what I see the most fit as a new interpretation for these parable novels is that we can see it as the parable, a parable of the 21st century. So by this, I mean, we can see it as a story that should bring us some moral message, some educational message, something that can be spread and also experienced artistically. And that is why I decided to call it the parable of the 21st century, because it warns us on one hand, but it also provides us with a solution. And in connection to previous presentations which I have seen, yes, I agree that this world is very cynical, and it is very aware of its cynical way and of many problems it is dealing with right now. And this is also why I really have to admit that I like Octavia Butler's dystopian novels, because they do not only bring the negativism and the criticism of the future and of our present, but also it provides some kind of hope, maybe some kind of ideological solution. So that's probably it from me now. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Okay, we have some questions, but I think we would like to listen to other panel right now, and later on, after listening, we'll discuss about both. Okay, so for now, we are really happy for Mr. Andreas Torres Scott and his prelection on topic an interpretation of pre-apocalyptic tropes in O. Butler's The Parable of the Soul.
Yeah, hi. Would you cast the video I sent?
Yes, in a minute.
Okay.
We need to.
Thank you.
Mateusz, are you there? Okay.
Thanks for the invitation to PhilosophyCon. My name is Andres Torres Scott, and I'm going to speak about Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower, an interpretation of three apocalyptic tropes. The tropes I'm gonna address are the religious trope, female leadership, and the Hobbesian state of nature. But first, let's get into the plot. This novel is part of the apocalyptic fiction subgenre, in which civilization is collapsing due to a climatic change. There is a scarcity of drinkable water, and rains are random. But the origins of this climate change are not explained in the novel. The story takes place in California, and there's a corruption of social norms. There's indebted servitude, which is legal again. Gang violence is usual. The federal government is weak. And states to the north of California and Canada are said to have drinkable water, good paid jobs, and enjoy law and order. But none of these are confirmed through the novel. The protagonist of The Parable of the Sower is Lauren Olamina, a black teenager. She's the daughter of a Baptist reverend. She's been educated in part by a Hispanic mother. She speaks Spanish. We get into her story in the midst of social turmoil in the year 2024, on the day of her 15th birthday, which happens to be her father's 55th birthday. She lives in Robledo, a walled Southern California community. In addition, Lauren suffers from hyperempathy, an extrasensorial perception disease caused by her mother having a drug named Parasetco. This makes Lauren feel other people's pleasure and pain, and certainly under an apocalyptic setting, most of the feelings that people are gonna share are about pain and not about pleasure. It happens in most of the apocalyptic fiction genre. We meet Lauren through her own diary and learn that besides writing on the current events she's facing, she also writes her own interpretation of God, her own religion. She calls her text Earthseed, the books of the living. Her interpretation is that God is, and that the destiny of the human race is to leave Earth and colonize other planets. 2. Female leadership. In the parable of the sower, leadership is female leadership, represented by the protagonist Lauren Olamine. We meet her as a 15-year-old who has a multicultural background. She has been educated by her stepmother, who is named Corey, and has a Hispanic background. She says she speaks Spanish, but across the novel she never says a word in Spanish. The following table compares selected Lauren's characteristics with other two protagonists of apocalyptic fiction works. I choose Lyle Verney, the first protagonist of a modern apocalyptic novel, The Last Man by Mary Shelley. I choose him because the novel was written by a woman, and I also choose Offred, the protagonist of Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. And I'm referring to Offred in the book, not in the series. You may know her by the name June, but it is not clear that her name is June in the novel. In addition, I include a column referencing the popular 11-year-old TV show The Walking Dead to see if the tropes and the roles appear here too. You can see the table on the screen. The Parable of the Sower, 1993, compared to The Last Man, 1826, Handmaid's Tale, 1985, and the current airing of The Walking Dead. 3 of these have been written by women. The first 3. The other one are The Walking Dead is a creation by graphic artists and writers. Point of view. The first 3 are diaries. Margaret Atwood's novel is a recorded diary, plus a metafictional epilogue. Here we do not have anything else. We have only Lauren Olamine's diary and the verses of her Earthseed religion. That does not count as a point of view, obviously. The narratological focus. All of the novels have an interdiegetic narrator and protagonist. The Walking Dead, this switches, this changes, but most of the times is a third person or extra diegetic narrator of point of view. The years the story takes place, Parable of the Sower, by pure coincidence, is very close to our date, 2024 to 2027. The others are a little bit further away, and The Walking Dead is taking place, well, right now, live action. Technological advancements, it's strange that none of these have any technological advances as other science fiction apocalyptic novels. Only slow-flying globes in The Last Man of Mary Shelley, 1826. She was definitely not putting emphasis on technological advancement. Then we enter into the most interesting thing. Leaders promoting a religion. And the inventor of this, of the crazy prophet, dividing a group, creating a coercive religion to take advantage of the end of the world, to survive and dominate other based on Judeo-Christian tradition, is this guy in Mary Shelley's Last Man, a crazy prophet. And this trope of a prophet trying to create a coercive religion and take advantage is repeated through most other apocalyptic novels or TV series. Well, in The Handmaid's Tale, these crazy guys are the rulers of the state, or Gilead, whatever is it called. In The Walking Dead, as in George Romero movies, we see the appearance of several priests that become a cult and are trying to divide the population in order to gather people for their own benefit. The Parable of the Sower, this is different, and this is what makes the novel more attractive. The protagonist, Lauren, is creating a religion to survive, not to divide. She's creating a religion to gather people, not to promote coercion. And it is not based on the fear of God, or under the Judeo-Christian tradition. This is a first on an apocalyptic fiction. The female leaders, evident that in Mary Shelley's The Last Man, there's no woman as the leader. Of course, a woman would have not been attractive on those times, and only we have two here, Lauren Olamina in The Parable of the Sower and Offred, or June, Handmaid's Tale. In The Walking Dead we have Maggie, Michonne and Carol, but they never assume a long-term leadership for a community. Yeah, basically it's male characters that are the leaders, not women in The Walking Dead. Of course it's written by men, so why to propose a female as a leader? Now, this is more interesting. Mention of feminine hygiene articles. In The Parable of the Sower, there are two mentions, because they stop in a store and they sell, it's a pharmacy, and, well, she asks for tampons. And when she leaves her home, she looks for tampons. The most natural thing to do. While in The Last Man, of course, there are some women survivors, but we never hear anything about tampons or periods or anything like that. Of course, that would be of bad taste in Victorian England. Handmaid's Tale, there's no mention of pads or tampons, only to describe an object similar to a pad, but nothing else. And of course in The Walking Dead, when they stopped into a store or into a place where they find things, not men, not women, they do not look for a hygienic product. Menstruation does not exist in The Walking Dead. I don't know if it is still or at any point was forbidden to mention in the US series, but they do not menstruate. Women at The Walking Dead do not menstruate, and they don't care if they bleed their pants. Or, of course, this is a screenplay written by men. Black characters' main feats. In The Parable of the Sower, the protagonist is a small, multicultural young teenager. In The Last Man, well, the couple of black men that appear are portrayed as miserable, evil, assassins, and sick. Totally a 19th century colonial stereotype. Handmaid's Tale, well, black Americans are known as the children of Ham and are resettled, but we do not know anything else. In the TV series, you can see possibly some black women around, but that is not happening in the novel. In The Walking Dead, well, the appearance of black characters is non-stereotypical, is aligned with political correctness. They are heroes and villains. They are female and male, totally neutral. There's no stigma on black characters. Magical or paranormal occurrences. Well, in The Parable of the Sower, the protagonist has an extrasensory perception ability that makes her feel others' pain and pleasure, which is more like a handicap and not an ability to take advantage of any situation, because you have to kill people all the time during an apocalypse. So you are suffering every time you kill something because you feel what the other feels. So it's great handicap. In The Last Man, there's the appearance of a black spectre, an eclipse, and in The Handmaid's Tale and The Walking Dead, I didn't find any paranormal or magical occurrences. Of course, there could be. I could have skipped one or two. Let's wrap up. So in The Parable of the Sower, we can see a protagonist who's different in several aspects. Her perception of black people is different. Second, she's a female teenager, and this is not a young adult novel. She is also handicapped by an inherent sickness, hyperempathy. It is still a handicap. No other protagonist is handicapped in apocalyptic novels. She's multiculturally educated. Have not seen this in other protagonists of apocalyptic novel. And as a result of all these, she has not prejudices against, specifically against black people, but also, and we can see through the novel, against Hispanic or Korean people. This is an interesting point because it is not due to political correctness or to television broadcaster guidelines, but to an intrinsic part of the plot and of the story. Finally, she is the only leader not using religion to divide a group, but to gather people together. And this is the most important thing here, that this is the first apocalyptic novel where religion, the use of religion, is not used for bad, but for good. Part 3, use of religion. Since the first apocalyptic modern novel, The Last Man by Mary Shelley, religion has been seen in times of apocalypse as a tool to divide, dominate, and abuse others. This trope is recurrent and it appears in apocalyptic works and especially movies. You can see it on most of George Romero's The Living Dead and its multiple remakes, and more recently all around the Walking Dead sitcom. This is not the case in the parable of the sower. Lauren's new religion of change is named Earthsid. I think the word is encompassing both sexes and unifying opposite, as earth is a reference for femininity, for Mother Earth, and seed is a clear inclusion of masculinity, as seed and semen come from the Latin word seminis. On this Earthsid religion, God is change. The narrator does not present a theological dissertation on the validity of her religious ideas, but just simple verses of the Book of the Living across the chapters of the book. Among the verses, I think this is the most relevant. All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Earthsid is explained in the Book of the Living. The name is given by Lauren to contrast the title of the Tibetan and Egyptian Book of the Dead. In the same very name, we can find the first idea against Christianity, because the Book of the Living is not a religion for the dead, for the afterworld. Earthsid is a religion for the living. In this sense, it has a Nietzschean tone, as it praises the ones alive and avoids any affection towards the afterworld, which is certainly a crucial foundation for Christianity. Earthsid is a nature-friendly religion. The community Lauren organizes is not male-centered, and it does not impose the idea that nature and man are separated and conflicted. The traditional point of view of Judeo-Christianity is that man can take anything he needs from nature and use it for his own survival without any responsibility. On the other hand, on Earthsid, Lauren enforces a feminine point of view towards nature, somehow in a reconciliatory tone, where preserving nature for survival is worth more than destroying it for the same ends. I think this idea of man having all rights over nature comes from the Adam and Eve tale. Eve is the one being compassive and approachable to nature, even to a serpent. She's the one getting closer to it and getting an apple. However, the consequential expulsion of both Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden made man believe he could do whatever he wanted to dominate nature. It is in this sense that we could see in Lauren a new Eve. However, Lauren can also be seen as a new Messiah, a new Christ, because she is bringing a new logos, a new word, a new parable that proposes reconciliation with nature and that is breaking with the old thoughts, as Jesus broke with the Old Testament. Octavia Butler mentions in an interview that she was inspired by the prominence of change in Buddhism to choose it as the main column of Lauren's religion. Nevertheless, I think Lauren's religion is closer to the original ideas of Heraclitus and Parmenides. Earthsid religion is intrinsically different from the male interpretation of Christianity, in the sense that it does not understand nature as an uncontrollable force that must be tamed, but a force that we need to live with. Moreover, Earthsid does not seek to differentiate Earthsid believers from unbelievers, as it happens in Christianity and Islam, where unbelievers are named infidels, and as it is the case of biblical Jewish, where the other peoples are simply not considered even human at all. There are different interpretations about Heraclitus and Parmenides, but I'm going to stick to Martin Heidegger's idea that both philosophers tried to explain the same thing and not to go against each. And what both were defending was the idea of the permanence of change to understand being. For Heraclitus, the existence is the union of opposites, the union of opposites in generation and destruction. For Heraclitus, this oppositional process was called eris, strife. And the unity of these opposites provoke change. So there is strife, war against opposites, and in the union of these opposites, change is either omitted or included. There's the famous fragment of the rebirth attributed to Heraclitus. It is impossible to step in the same river twice, or we both step and do not step in the same rivers. We are and are not. So the river remains, but the water changes. We remain, but at the same time, we are not the same the second time we step into the rivers. So change is present with impermanence. On the other hand, Parmenides said that change is impossible, that reality is only one, and existence is timeless. So his philosophy has been synthesized with saying whatever is, and what is not, cannot be. So let's put an example. An egg is an egg and a chicken is a chicken. Both are different things. But are they totally different? Can we say that the chicken is not an egg and that the egg is not a chicken? Well, for Parmenides, there is not egg separated from chicken. We cannot say that an egg is not a chicken or that a chicken is not an egg. So, as from nothing comes nothing, as Parmenides said, and thus change does not exist, and things are despite appearances, everything exists as one giant, unchanging thing. So change is basically non-existent, or the paste that is sticking together all the stances of being. So how do we understand change in the Earthseed religion? Well, first, and according to Heraclitus, in the sense of a strife between opposites that get unified through change. And again, the opposites find another contrary to transform themselves. So they remain as the river, and they keep flowing with different waters. Second, and according to Parmenides, change is not a being. God is not a being. Change in Earthseed is the paste that brings together beings. Change is the element that unifies transformation on things, on all things, which are at the end one and only unchanging thing. Fourth, Hobbesian state of nature. All around the parable of the sower, the reader can see scenes of violence against the small established communities. The main example is Robledo, where Lauren and her family live. Inside these walled communities like Robledo, you can have a tranquil life. However, you have to go outside this walled community to get to your job, to study, to go to the stores. In the case of the parable of the sower, if you get outside, there's no law. You have to pay the police if you are assaulted, raped, or robbed. And if you don't pay, they are not going to follow the crime. In political theory, this means that the state is not present all over the territory. This means there's no force to enforce the social contract. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century brought the idea of a social contract among people in order to live in peace. He thought that as men are evil by nature, we need to enforce a social contract in which we will cede part of our will to a king, to a sovereign. Then, guilelessness and egalitarianism are exchanged for knowledge and subordination. For instance, we'll not be able to build a house wherever we want, but in return, we will have protection against other persons. Hobbes said, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That is what is life like in the state of nature without a social contract. This is what is happening outside Robledo, but as the surroundings are so violent and there's no social contract anymore, Robledo at a certain point gets burnt and is totally destroyed. Inside these walled communities like Robledo, you can have a tranquil life. However, you have to go outside this walled community to get to your job, to study, to go to the stores. In the case of the parable of the sower, if you get outside, there's no law. You have to pay the police if you are assaulted, raped, or robbed. And if you don't pay, then nobody is going to prosecute the crime. In political theory, this means that the state is not present all over the territory. There's no force to enforce the social contract. Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century brought the idea of a social contract among people in order to live in peace. He thought that as men are evil by nature, we need to enforce a social contract in which we will cede part of our will to a king, to a sovereign. Then, guilelessness and egalitarianism are exchanged for knowledge and subordination. For instance, we'll not be able to build a house wherever we want, but in return, we will have protection against other persons, as they are all evil, right? Hobbes said, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. That is what is life like in the state of nature without a social contract. This is what is happening outside Robledo, but as the surroundings are so violent and there's no social contract anymore, Robledo at a certain point gets burnt and is totally destroyed. After Robledo is burnt and all the family members of our protagonist Lauren are missing or possibly dead, she faces a period of change, or strife, as Heraclitus said, where a new social contract is needed. And this is what pushes Lauren to start preaching. So it is in this sense that Lauren breaks with the stereotypical mold of the leading survivor protagonist in an apocalypse that is preaching a religion to divide and get in power. She is preaching a religion, and instead of resisting destruction, she tries to live with the effects caused by that destruction. She uses religion to embrace change and to adapt. So I'm going to go back to Hobbes. In his theory, the king embodies the will of all subjects, and this idea becomes the Leviathan, the mortal god, the state that is going to protect us as we cede part of our liberties. This change from being a savage to being a citizen is only achieved by resigning to a part of our own will. What happens in the parable of the sower is that Earthseed, this new religion, is the new Leviathan, the element bringing together the wills of the people to create a new social contract, a new Leviathan. Earthseed is also change in this brutish, savage word. Change is God, and it is bringing people together. It is the transformation element unifying the whole, as Parmenides also said. Conclusions. Well, first of all, we have a new teenager leader in a not young adult novel who is black, who is a female, and is multicultural. This is a very first in apocalyptic novels. Second, and this is also very first in apocalyptic novels, religion is used to gather people together, not to divide. The religious leader is not a crazy guy fostering hate against the ones not belonging to this religion. Third, Earthseed is a religion of change, similar to the philosophical explanations of Heraclitus and Parmenides, and not a promotion of the afterworld. So, thank you very much. This is all, and read Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So thank you very much. First thing, like we have some questions for you, of course, but first thing, maybe you have some questions to the presentations, to the productions. Not really. Okay. Then to Ms. Josefa, we have a question. How would the growth of an Earthseed-like religion in the real world change the socio-economic realities?
Is that for me or for any of us?
whoever wants to like answer, we'll discuss maybe.
Well, thing is that in the real world, I don't really know. I mean, we're talking about fiction here, so we should speculate, but certainly our speculation is going to be wrong. So I would say it would be like similar to a Buddhist religion, no? Most inclined to peaceful thinking and considering and assuming change as something you have to deal with. Possibly in this 21st century, it will be a little bit more stoicist religion, like just trying to overcome change and the challenges it presents. I don't know if you agree with me, Joja, or you would say something different.
No, that's actually why I thought of Earthseed as maybe a parable, as more of artistic interpretation of philosophy, because it would be very difficult to create authentic and powerful movement that would really influence the mechanisms of global society and economy. But as in terms of some kind of myth or this parable, it could be used as a reminder for people, for individuals, to maybe change some small habits of theirs and to add their small bit to some maybe bigger wave of changes. Because yes, one thing is that it would be a very specific kind of religion, as Andres said, that might not be as functional or as applicable as we desire. And the other thing is that there are so many other movements, and well, I'm very pragmatic and maybe even pessimistic here, but there's a great chance that such a grassroots movement would simply not get through the informational buzz of global internet and culture. So but for individuals, it could be possibly an inspiration or some guide for smaller changes in their lives.
Okay. Okay, Mateus joined us, so maybe you have also some questions.
Yes, as I understand, the Earthseed religion, a big part of it is leaving Earth behind and colonizing other planets. And as one of our speakers yesterday, I think, mentioned, it's completely an escapist fantasy. Exploring space, terraforming, and so on, it costs tremendous amounts of money, and perhaps we could invest it to heal Earth and to change here, to introduce change now. What do you think is the more important aspect to this parable of the sower? Is it really about changing the world here and now, or is it about creating a completely new reality while leaving the past behind?
This was actually mentioned in the novels, that the life of humanity, of people on Earth, was seen as a kind of childhood, and the part we consider escapist, the arrival on different other planets and colonizing them and settling there, was considered by Lauren some kind of adulthood of humanity, or the next step in evolution, let's say. It is interesting to compare these, and this is probably why Earthseed as such cannot be applied in general, because despite all the similarities, we as humankind have taken slightly different route from this dystopian novel, because where Lauren decides that Earth is simply that we have as humanity overcome the Earth and existence on Earth, and that Earth probably wouldn't be enough or maybe can't be saved as such. Here in reality, we are still trying to save it and to make it a better place. So this is something that I consider purely fictional, maybe, or something of a literary concept, this part of adulthood, or this evolution or growing up of humankind.
Do you have anything to add, Andres?
Yeah, the phrase of the year, you're on mute, right? Sorry for that. I think that the most important thing is the features of the female character for an apocalyptic fiction, because she is a woman and she's got a multicultural inheritance, and she worries about things women worry. And we haven't seen these on any former apocalyptic fiction novels. So, I mean, not even in the Handmaid's Tale, right? So, which I mean, I would say that in regards to literary quality is better. Like Margaret Atwood has a great literary quality, but in terms of the character, this Lauren Olamina has lots of innovations that are just being recalled. And I mean, let's think about it. It was written 20 years ago, so on 1993. So no more, 30 years ago. So we haven't studied this Octavia Butler's text seriously. That's my belief, and that's why I choose to talk about it now. Thank you.
Maybe you have some questions for each other, since you obviously discussed the same book and you have different perspectives on this.
Maybe not a question, but I found it interesting when you mentioned female hygiene artifacts, you called it, as they were mentioned in the parable of the sower, because if I remember correctly, it's interesting to note that not only the tampons were mentioned, but still when we talk about the maybe feminine and masculine perception of intimacy and hygiene and sexuality, it's interesting to see that at first that there was that the women were emancipated in terms of their relationships with men, and that in 1993, Octavia Butler, let's say, allowed herself to write something like that women enjoy sex, for example, or to mention that women actively search for condoms or for protection against pregnancy, or that they deal with pregnancy as not maybe always a blessing, but also as something that could cause problems with their survival. So just only wanted to add this, that for a novel which is almost 30 years old, and it brought some progressive ideas and visions.
Oh yes, Georgia, I didn't mention that, but you are right. I totally agree with you. This is also the first apocalyptic fiction novel where I see that women are not afraid of mentioning sex and enjoying sex in this landscape of dystopian landscape or end of the world situation. No, would be a first too in that sense. You're right. Thank you for pointing it out.
Yeah.
Okay, there are no other questions at the moment. I think it is high time to finish this whole thing. It's been 3 days. Thank you guys for joining us again. And also, thanks. I would like to thank Zuza and Kasper for moderating the couple of
Thank you also for talking with
Thank
us.
you, everyone. My
Thank you.
pleasure.
Thank you
Yeah,
for your
thank
invitation.
you. Also, I would like to say, yeah, thanks for wanting to join us this time. Perhaps it will be possible next time. I hope to see you in person. And Mexico is also on my list, so you never know, Andres.
I'd be very happy to join
Sure,
in
you'll be
person.
happy to have you here, to host you here, guys. And see you on the next one, 78 edition.
Okay. So,
Yeah.
thank you very
Yeah.
much. Hope that you enjoyed, and that would be last prelection and the end of PhilosophyCon, the 7th edition of PhilosophyCon. We were really happy that you joined us. Thank you very much, and hope that we will see you in next edition next year.
I hope so too.
Goodbye. Or
Goodbye.
have a nice day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
And also, one last thing for our Polish viewers, it will be in Polish. Yeah, we'll understand. Anyway, musimy wracać z Krakowa na Śląsk. Dlatego nie zrobimy jednak quizu, za co jeszcze raz przepraszam. I zrobimy osobną okazję. I wtedy jeszcze porozmawiamy o Dunie. Porozdajemy wszystko, co dla Was przygotowaliśmy. Dziękuję wszystkim za udział. Thanks. Dobranoc. Do zobaczenia w może lżejszych czasach. Może jak będzie jaśniej, cieplej i mniej covidowo. Chcesz coś dodać?
No, myślę, że to samo. Do zobaczenia następnym razem, na następnej edycji w lepszych, może bardziej stacjonarnych też warunkach. Może więcej będzie miejsc stacjonarnie, albo więcej z kolei, nie wiem. Myślę, że ta edycja tak czy siak była dość udana, więc...
To jest młodość i optymizm. Dziękujemy. Do widzenia.
Dziękujemy wszystkim.